There are flowers that should never have been found, petals that harbor something ancient, something that existed before human civilization understood the concept of contagion. Deep beneath the earth in West Africa, in caverns that predate written history, grew a species of plant that the Undapaya people called the stairway to the sun. These flowers were not simply beautiful or rare, they were death in botanical form, containing within their genetic structure a virus that would eventually become the foundation of humanity's most catastrophic bioweapon, the tyrant virus, better known as the T virus. The story of the T virus begins not in a sterile laboratory with men in white coats manipulating DNA sequences, but in darkness, in underground chambers where sunlight was bent and reflected through ingenious engineering, where ancient kings consumed poison to prove their worthiness to rule, where mutation was mistaken for divinity. The Indapaya kingdom thrived for centuries, perhaps millennia, built upon a ritual that modern science would later recognize as viral infection. Their leaders were not chosen by bloodline or combat prowess, but by survival. Those who ate the stairway to the sun and lived through the horrific transformation, the fever, the cellular breakdown, the genetic rewriting, emerged as something more than human. Enhanced strength, unnaturally long life, perhaps even genius level intellect. Then Dapaya worshipped these survivors as god kings, unaware that what they were witnessing was not divine intervention, but a double stranded RNA virus expressing itself in human tissue. The flowers themselves were ecological anomalies. They required specific environmental conditions to produce the virus. The exact humidity, temperature, and soil composition found only in certain areas of the Ndapaya caverns. Remove the flowers from this environment, and they became merely beautiful, merely toxic, but not transformative. The virus remained dormant, inactive, locked within junk DNA that would never express itself. This specificity would later prove to be Umbrella Corporation's greatest challenge. You cannot weaponize what you cannot cultivate. You cannot mass produce a bioweapon that requires the precise recreation of a prehistoric ecosystem. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Before Umbrella, before laboratories, before the T virus had a name or a military designation, there were only the Ndapaya and their sacred flowers. The tribe constructed elaborate architectural system within their underground city, reflective surfaces that channeled sunlight through impossible angles, concentrated beams of light that could burn flesh, automated defense systems powered by nothing more than geometry and solar energy. This was Stone Age engineering that surpassed anything their contemporaries built above ground. How? The virus. Those god kings who survived the stairway to the sun brought back more than just enhanced physical capabilities. They brought back enhanced cognition, the ability to conceptualize and execute construction projects that should have been impossible for their level of technological development. Yet despite their advancement, the Ndapaya kingdom fell. Ancient murals discovered in the ruins suggest the downfall was sudden and catastrophic. The same virus that elevated their kings to godhood also infected local wildlife. Animals exposed to the flowers or to viral contamination in the water supply mutated into aggressive, powerful variants of their normal selves. The engravings show these creatures escaping containment, attacking the population, overwhelming even the tribe's warrior class. Whether the Ndapaya deliberately experimented on animals or whether the contamination was accidental remains unknown. What is certain is that the city was abandoned, left to decay in darkness for centuries. The survivors fled to the marshlands, establishing smaller settlements away from the caverns. But they did not forget. The underground ruins remained sacred. forbidden to outsiders. Young warriors of the tribe spent 2-year rotations guarding the old city, ensuring that no one would stumble upon the Garden of the Sun, the central chamber where the stairway to the sunflowers grew in concentrated clusters. This cultural taboo protected the world from the progenitor virus for generations. The Ndapaya kept the secret through warfare and vigilance, killing or driving away anyone who ventured too close to the ruins. Then came the 19th century, and with it, European colonialism. Henry Travis, son of a prominent British merchant family, led expeditions throughout Africa, documenting flora, fauna, indigenous cultures, and folklore. His 72-volume encyclopedia, Survey of Natural History, contained meticulous descriptions of everything he encountered, including detailed accounts of Ndapaya legends. Travis recorded stories about the stairway to the sun, about tribal kings who ate poisonous flowers and emerged transformed, about an ancient underground city guarded by warriors who would die before revealing its location. He documented these tales with scholarly precision, treating them as anthropological curiosities rather than literal truth. The European academic community dismissed Travis's work. The idea of an advanced Stone Age civilization existing in sub-Saharan Africa contradicted prevailing racial theories of the time. The notion that consuming a toxic flower could grant superhuman abilities was filed away as primitive superstition, the kind of magical thinking that civilized science had moved beyond. Travis's encyclopedias gathered dust in university libraries, read by almost no one, remembered by fewer. Almost no one, but not quite no one. In the mid-1960s, an Anglo-American eugenics circle stumbled upon Travis's work. These were not fringe conspiracists or mad scientists, but educated, wealthy individuals who believed that human evolution could be guided, accelerated, perfected through scientific intervention. Among them were 3 men who would forever alter the course of bioweapons development: Lord Oswell E. Spencer, a British aristocrat with vast financial resources and connections to military intelligence; Dr. Edward Ashford, a respected virologist from a family with generational ties to pharmaceutical research; and Dr. James Marcus, a brilliant but eccentric biologist whose academic career had been marked by both genius and ethical controversy. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus became obsessed with Travis's accounts of the Ndapaya rituals. If the legends were true, if a naturally occurring substance could trigger beneficial mutations in humans, then the implications for eugenics were staggering. This was not selective breeding or genetic counseling, the standard approaches of the era. This was forced evolution at the viral level, the possibility of creating a superhuman race not through generational selection but through direct biological intervention. The group theorized that Travis had encountered a mutagenic virus hosted by the flowers, a virus that killed most subjects but transformed the survivors. They called this hypothetical pathogen progenitor, meaning ancestor or originator. If it existed, if it could be isolated and studied, if it could be controlled, then progenitor would be the progenitor of a new stage in human development. Spencer imagined a world ruled by those enhanced by the virus, an elite class of superhuman beings with himself as their architect and leader. Ashford approached the concept more scientifically, interested in pure research for its own sake. Marcus saw both potential, weapons, and evolution intertwined. In 1966, the 3 men organized an expedition to West Africa, specifically to the Kajuju region where Travis had encountered the Ndapaya. Spencer provided the funding. Ashford contributed his scientific expertise. Marcus brought his student Brandon Bailey, a young researcher who would prove instrumental in later virus cultivation efforts. They spent 3 months searching for the underground city, fighting periodic skirmishes with Undapaya warriors who defended their ancestral home with primitive weapons and superior terrain knowledge. The local population knew what these outsiders sought, and they knew what would happen if the flowers fell into foreign hands. But superior numbers and modern firearms eventually prevailed. On December 4th, 1966, the expedition located the entrance to the cavern system. They descended into darkness that was not quite darkness, illuminated by those ancient light reflection systems that still functioned after centuries of neglect. They navigated past traps, pressure plates that triggered rock falls, concentrated solar beams that could incinerate flesh, flooding mechanisms designed to drown invaders. They reached the Garden of the Sun. The flowers grew in a natural terraced arrangement, cascading down rock formations in the specific microclimate that allowed viral expression. Bailey carefully collected samples, flowers, soil, root systems, everything that might be necessary to recreate the growing conditions. Marcus conducted preliminary tests on site, confirming that the flowers contained an active viral agent. The expedition had found their progenitor. They confirmed the virus's existence and its properties through initial field analysis. It was indeed an RNA-based retrovirus, similar in structure to filoviruses like Ebola or Marburg, both of which also originated in Africa. Like those deadly pathogens, progenitor thrived in dark, cool, humid environments. But unlike Ebola, which killed through hemorrhagic fever, progenitor killed through mutation. It integrated itself into host DNA, rewriting genetic instructions, triggering uncontrolled cellular transformation. Most subjects died as their bodies tore themselves apart trying to accommodate the viral rewrites. But some survived, and those survivors exhibited the enhanced capabilities that Ndapaya legend had described. The expedition left the caverns in December 1966, taking their samples and leaving the Undapaya warriors to contemplate their failure to protect what had been sacred for generations. Many young Undapaya had consumed the flowers in desperate attempts to gain the strength needed to repel the invaders, only to die from the virus. The foreigners had stolen not just plants, but the tribe's future. Without access to their own sacred flower, without the ritual that selected their leaders, the Undapaya's cultural structure began to collapse. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus returned with samples they could not use. This became immediately apparent when they attempted to cultivate the flowers in European and American facilities. The transported plants grew, but they did not produce the virus. Bailey spent months adjusting variables, different soil compositions, temperature ranges, humidity levels, light exposure, but nothing triggered viral expression outside the specific conditions of the Undapaya caverns. The flowers had become ornamental, beautiful, but useless for their purposes. This represented a critical problem. Their eugenics project required a consistent supply of progenitor for research and experimentation. They could not repeatedly send expeditions to West Africa, fighting hostile locals each time they needed more samples. The virus had to be cultivated, controlled, made accessible. But how do you replicate an environment that evolved over millennia in a specific geological formation? The answer, it turned out, required years of additional research and significant financial investment. But first, they needed a cover. 3 scientists openly researching a mutagenic virus from West Africa would attract immediate attention from regulatory bodies, ethics committees, and potentially rival research groups. They needed legitimacy, the appearance of respectability, a public face that would allow private experimentation. In March 1967, just 3 months after returning from Africa, Spencer founded Umbrella Pharmaceuticals. The name was deliberately chosen. An umbrella shelters, protects, covers. It suggested benevolence, public health, corporate responsibility. The company's public face focused on pharmaceutical development, health products, consumer goods, umbrella branded shampoo, toothpaste, pain relievers, antibiotics. The profits from these legitimate products would fund the real research, the hidden work on progenitor. From the beginning, Umbrella was a front. Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus were not interested in curing diseases or improving public health except as means to an end. The end was the Wesker Project, Spencer's plan to use mutagenic viruses to create a superior human race with himself as its architect and leader. But such research required money, infrastructure, and political protection. Umbrella Pharmaceuticals provided all three. It became one of the world's largest pharmaceutical corporations, with facilities on multiple continents, research laboratories hidden beneath legitimate production facilities, and enough wealth to buy political influence in dozens of countries. The three founders each took responsibility for separate research initiatives, establishing laboratories to pursue independent progenitor studies. This division of labor made sense practically. More researchers meant faster progress, but it also reflected the growing tension between the three men. Spencer was revealed to be not just a financial backer, but a manipulator with totalitarian ambitions. Ashford remained focused on pure research, uncomfortable with the military application Spencer clearly intended. Marcus grew increasingly paranoid, suspecting that Spencer wanted to steal his work and claim credit for any breakthroughs. Ashford established a research facility in Antarctica at his family estate, isolated and secure. Spencer set up operations in the Arklay Mountains outside Raccoon City in the United States, building a mansion that served as cover for an underground laboratory. Marcus was initially supposed to continue progenitor research at a European facility, but Spencer had different plans for him. Spencer recognized that Marcus was both valuable and dangerous. Valuable because his understanding of virology was unmatched among the three founders. Dangerous because his growing paranoia and his obsessive dedication to research made him unpredictable. Spencer needed Marcus where he could be watched, where his work could be monitored and controlled. In 1968, Spencer convinced Marcus to take a position as director of the newly established Umbrella Executive Training School in the Arklay Mountains. This facility was ostensibly designed to train future Umbrella employees, teaching them company protocols, pharmaceutical development procedures, and corporate culture. The reality was darker. The school was an indoctrination center, conditioning young minds to accept the ethical violations necessary for bioweapons research. Students learned to view human test subjects as data points, to prioritize results over morality, to serve Umbrella's goals without question. And beneath the training school, Marcus had a private laboratory where he could continue his progenitor work while simultaneously grooming the next generation of Umbrella scientists. Marcus accepted the position, though he resented being pulled away from pure research. He threw himself into both roles, teaching and experimentation, with characteristic obsession. His teaching methods were rigorous, his standards impossibly high, his expectations brutal. Most students washed out. Those who remained were shaped into exactly what Spencer needed. Brilliant, amoral researchers loyal to Umbrella above all else. But Marcus's real focus remained the virus. The progenitor samples Bailey had collected were finite, and without a way to cultivate more, the entire project would eventually hit a wall. Marcus experimented with different approaches to viral cultivation, different host organisms, different environmental controls. Nothing worked. The virus remained stubbornly tied to its original ecosystem. Then, in September 1968, Bailey, now running a research station back in the West African caverns, made a breakthrough. By studying the local environmental factors in minute detail, he identified the specific combination of conditions necessary for viral expression. Temperature had to be within a precise range. Humidity needed exact levels. The soil composition required trace minerals in specific ratios. Light exposure had to follow particular day-night cycles, mimicking the natural light reflection in the caverns. It was an incredibly narrow window, but it was achievable in a laboratory setting. Bailey began cultivating new progenitor samples at what became known as the African Lab, shipping them to Marcus at the training facility. For the first time, the three founders had access to a renewable supply of the virus. Research could proceed in earnest. But that same year, 1968, brought tragedy that was not quite tragedy. Edward Ashford died from exposure to progenitor virus during a laboratory accident at his Antarctic facility. The official report described it as an unfortunate containment breach. A respected scientist killed by the very pathogen he was studying. The reality, strongly suspected but never proven, was that Spencer orchestrated Ashford's death. Ashford had become a liability. His moral objections to weaponizing progenitor, his insistence on focusing purely on beneficial mutations, his resistance to human experimentation, these scruples threatened the entire project. Spencer needed researchers who would do what was necessary without ethical hesitation. Ashford would not, so Ashford had to go. A small containment breach, easily staged. Progenitor was fatal to most humans. Ashford became another casualty of the virus, and Spencer consolidated power. With Ashford dead, only Spencer and Marcus remained as Umbrella's founders. The company was Spencer's now, completely under his control. Marcus continued his research at the training facility, unaware that he had just witnessed a demonstration of how Spencer dealt with obstacles. The years that followed, from 1968 to 1978, were marked by intensive research but limited progress. Progenitor was incredibly lethal. Almost everyone exposed to the virus died. The rare survivors exhibited the enhanced capabilities the founders had sought, but the mortality rate made progenitor unusable for Spencer's eugenics program. You cannot create a master race if 99% of candidates die during transformation. The virus needed to be modified, weakened in lethality, but maintaining its mutagenic properties. Both Spencer and Marcus worked on this problem independently. Spencer at the Arklay laboratory beneath his mansion, Marcus at the training facility. They tested different approaches. Spencer experimented with multiple progenitor strains, designated type A and type B, attempting to identify variations with lower mortality rates. Marcus took a different approach. He began combining progenitor with genetic material from other organisms, attempting to create hybrid viruses that retained mutagenic properties while being less immediately fatal. Marcus ran experiments on countless species. Insects showed limited mutation, some increased size and aggression, but insects had essentially reached an evolutionary dead end millions of years ago. There was not much potential for further adaptation. Amphibians responded better. Frogs infected with progenitor developed enhanced jumping power and abnormal tongue growth, though their intelligence remained unchanged and their appetite increased to dangerous levels. They became aggressive predators, but nothing that could be controlled or weaponized effectively. Then Marcus turned to leeches. Leeches were simple organisms, segmented worms with primitive nervous systems. They fed on blood, attached to hosts for days or weeks, could survive in diverse environments. Marcus theorized that their simplicity might make them ideal viral vectors, organisms that could carry and transmit the virus while being relatively easy to control. He was spectacularly correct. In September 1977, Marcus successfully combined progenitor with leech DNA. The hybrid organism, leech cells infected with the virus, exhibited remarkable properties. The leeches grew dramatically in size, developing enhanced strength and, surprisingly, increased neural capacity. They could be trained to follow simple commands. They could coordinate group behavior. Most remarkably, they could reproduce while infected, creating offspring that carried the modified virus in their genetic structure. But Marcus did not announce his breakthrough. His paranoia regarding Spencer had intensified over the years. He suspected, correctly, that Spencer was monitoring his work, waiting to steal any significant discoveries. Marcus confided only in Bailey, sending coded telegrams to the African lab describing his progress. He refined the virus over the following months, testing it on additional leech populations, documenting the mutations, perfecting the genetic combination. In January 1978, Marcus achieved what would become the most significant breakthrough in bioweapons history. He successfully stabilized the progenitor leech hybrid into a distinct viral strain. This new virus retained progenitor's mutagenic properties, but with a crucial difference: it could infect humans without the near universal fatality rate. The mortality rate was still high, perhaps 60 to 70%, but that left 30 to 40% survival, enough to be useful. Those who survived infection did not become superhumans in the endopia sense. Instead, they underwent a different transformation, one that would define horror for the next several decades. Marcus called his creation the tyrant virus, or T-virus, named for the ultimate bioweapon he envisioned: a tyrant, a humanoid creature of enhanced strength and durability that could follow basic commands and serve as a living weapon. The T-virus was version 3.0 in the progression from the natural stairway to the sunflowers through progenitor to this weaponized form. But Marcus still did not share his discovery with Spencer or Umbrella's leadership. He intended to present his findings directly to the executive board, bypassing Spencer entirely, using the T-virus as leverage to gain a seat on that board and secure his position within the company. He believed his breakthrough gave him power, made him untouchable. He was wrong. Spencer learned about the T-virus through his monitoring of Marcus's communications with Bailey. On July 29, 1978, Spencer officially shut down the Umbrella Executive Training School. Students were transferred to other facilities. Marcus was stripped of his teaching position. The T-virus project was transferred to the Arklay Laboratory, now under the direction of Spencer's most promising young researchers, Dr. William Birkin and Dr. Albert Wesker. Birkin and Wesker had been Marcus's star pupils, two child prodigies who excelled in the training program. Birkin earned his doctorate at 15 and was hired by Umbrella at that age, making him the youngest researcher in company history. Wesker was equally brilliant, with a ruthless personality perfectly suited to Umbrella's real mission. Marcus had taught them virology, molecular biology, genetic engineering. He had trained them to be exceptional scientists. He had also, unknowingly, trained them to betray him. Spencer transferred Birkin and Wesker to the Arklay laboratory with instructions to continue T-virus research while simultaneously spying on Marcus. The two young scientists were told to compile evidence of Marcus's activities, document any ethical violations, and report directly to Spencer. They did exactly that. Over the course of their education, they had witnessed Marcus using training school students as test subjects, exposing them to progenitor and T virus variants, observing the results of infection. More than 20 students had disappeared during Marcus's tenure, their bodies disposed of in underground streams or preserved as specimens. Birkin and Wesker documented all of it, sending detailed reports to Spencer. Marcus, meanwhile, continued working at the now closed training facility, refusing to leave his laboratory. He refined the T-virus, created the first T-virus-based bioorganic weapons, including plague crawlers, lurkers, and eliminators. He became increasingly isolated, spending weeks at a time locked in his private lab, obsessed with his research and with his plans to overthrow Spencer. His mental state deteriorated. He began using his own research assistants as guinea pigs for leech experiments, infecting them to observe the results. Spencer's paranoia peaked. Marcus was no longer just a liability, but an active threat. He had to be eliminated. In 1988, Spencer gave the order. Birkin and Wesker were to facilitate Marcus's assassination. On that day in 1988, Birkin and Wesker arrived at the training facility, accompanied by a team from Umbrella Security Service. They found Marcus in his laboratory, surrounded by leech tanks, research notes, and the results of a decade of obsessive experimentation. The USS Commandos gunned him down. Marcus died on the floor of his own lab, murdered by the company he had helped found, betrayed by the students he had trained. Birkin and Wesker collected all of Marcus's research data, 10 years of work he had kept secret from Spencer, and left his body where it fell. They also disposed of what they considered failed experiments, including a queen leech that Marcus had been developing, a creature of enormous size with unusual neural capacity. They dumped the queen leech into the same underground stream where Marcus had disposed of student corpses over the years. This was meant to be the end of Marcus's story, the founder who became an obstacle, eliminated and forgotten. Birkin was officially credited with creating the T-virus. Marcus's name was all but erased from Umbrella's company records, and research continued under Spencer's complete control. The T-virus project moved forward at the Arklay laboratory, now with Birkin as its lead researcher and access to all of Marcus's notes and samples. But Marcus's story was not over. The queen leech, dumped in the river alongside Marcus's corpse, entered his body. It began feeding on his tissues, absorbing his DNA, ingesting his brain cells, and with them his memories. The T-virus was designed to mutate organisms, to rewrite their genetic structure. The queen leech mutated, incorporating Marcus's genetic material into its own. Over the course of 10 years, from 1988 to 1998, the leech essentially became Marcus, reconstructing his body, his appearance, even his consciousness from the absorbed cellular material. This was unprecedented. The T-virus had created a clone through parasitic absorption, a new organism that was neither leech nor human, but something combining both. The Marcus that emerged in 1998 was not the original man, but a biological facsimile with his memories, his personality, his rage. And that rage was considerable. The Queen Leech Marcus hybrid remembered the betrayal, the assassination, the theft of his life's work. It wanted revenge. In 1998, this hybrid initiated a plan to destroy Umbrella and everyone responsible for Marcus's death. It infiltrated the Arklay laboratory, releasing the T-virus throughout the facility and the surrounding forest. It attacked the Ecliptic Express, a luxury train for transporting umbrella employees, infecting everyone aboard and turning them into zombies. It spread the virus to the recently reopened training facility. The goal was to expose Umbrella's bioweapons research, to force a public reckoning, to see Spencer and his company destroyed. The events that followed in July 1998 would lead to the Mansion incident, the deployment of the Raccoon City Police Department's STARS teams, and eventually the complete destruction of Raccoon City. But those stories belong to a different narrative. What matters for understanding the T virus's origin is that the Queen, Leech Marcus, was stopped before it could fully execute its revenge. STARS officer Rebecca Chambers and former Marine Billy Cohen fought their way through the infected train and training facility, eventually confronting the creature in its fully mutated form. They discovered its weakness: ultraviolet light from sunlight, which destroyed the T virus's cellular structure and killed it. Marcus died again, this time permanently. But his creation, the T virus, lived on, and it would kill millions. This brings us to what the T virus actually is, mechanically and biologically. Understanding its origin in African flowers and leech DNA only explains the how of its creation. To understand what made it so catastrophic, we need to examine what the virus does at the cellular level, how it transforms living organisms into the monsters that define the Resident Evil franchise. The T virus is a retrovirus, meaning it inserts its genetic material into host DNA. When the virus makes contact with a cell membrane, it uses a process called reverse transcription to copy its RNA and integrate it into the host's genetic code. This effectively hijacks the cell's normal functions, reprogramming it to produce copies of the virus. These new variants are then released to infect neighboring cells, beginning the process again. But T virus does more than just replicate. It actively rewrites host DNA, triggering mutations throughout the body. The exact nature of these mutations depends on several factors: the host species, the viral strain, the method of infection, and the individual host genetic makeup. But certain effects are consistent across most infections. First, the virus causes aggressive cellular breakdown, a process called necrosis. The T virus consumes cellular material to produce energy, essentially eating the host from the inside. This breakdown causes the infected organism to literally rot while still alive. Skin becomes discolored and begins sloughing off. Internal organs fail. The body enters a state that should be death, but is not, maintained in a horrific twilight by viral activity that keeps basic functions operational. Second, the virus triggers changes to the host's central nervous system. In humans, all higher brain functions are destroyed. The prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the areas responsible for reasoning, memory, personality, all of this neural tissue dies or becomes irreparably damaged. What remains is the brainstem, the primitive reptilian brain that handles basic drives. The infected human becomes a zombie in the classical sense, a body without consciousness, driven by the most fundamental biological imperative: feed. This feeding drive is incredibly powerful. T virus zombies attack anything that moves, attempting to bite and consume living flesh. This serves the virus's reproductive strategy. Each bite potentially transmits the virus to a new host. The zombie is a vector, a walking infection delivery system, and because the virus keeps the host mobile even after death, even after the body should have collapsed from organ failure, zombies can continue spreading the virus for extended periods. Third, the virus dramatically increases the host's physical durability in specific ways. Pain response is eliminated. Zombies do not register injury the way living humans do. They can continue functioning with massive trauma that would incapacitate or kill a normal person. Broken limbs, gunshot wounds, even partial decapitation may not stop them. Only destruction of the brainstem, severing the few neural pathways the virus still uses, will truly kill a T virus zombie. However, this durability is not infinite. The cellular breakdown continues throughout infection. Zombies decay, slowly but steadily. Eventually, the body becomes too damaged to function and collapses. The timeline varies depending on environmental conditions. Heat and humidity accelerate decay, but most T virus zombies have a functional lifespan of several weeks to a few months after initial infection. The infection process itself takes approximately 5 to 6 hours in humans. Someone bitten by a zombie will initially experience fever, nausea, and pain at the bite site. Over the following hours, fever intensifies, consciousness becomes intermittent, and the victim enters a coma-like state. During this period, the virus is rewriting their DNA, destroying higher brain functions, and triggering the mutations that will create a zombie. When the victim wakes, they are no longer themselves. The person is gone. Only the virus remains wearing their body, but zombies were never the intended goal of T virus research. Marcus designed the virus to create tyrants, intelligent, powerful bioweapons that could follow commands and serve military purposes. The zombie outcome was a side effect, a mutation that occurred in hosts who lacked specific genetic characteristics necessary for controlled transformation. The T virus affects different species in different ways. In insects, it primarily causes gigantism. Spiders, wasps, and moths grow to enormous sizes, 5 or 10 times their normal dimensions, while retaining their basic behavioral patterns. In reptiles, particularly in combination with human genetic material, the virus creates hunters, bipedal creatures with enhanced strength, speed, and most dangerously, pack intelligence. In mammals like dogs, the virus produces Cerberus specimens, infected canines with exposed muscle tissue, enhanced aggression, and the same elimination of pain response seen in human zombies. Plants infected with T virus undergo dramatic mutations as well. Plant 42, one of the most documented T virus plant infections, grew into a massive carnivorous organism that filled an entire room, developing tentacle-like vines capable of grabbing and crushing prey. The virus's ability to mutate across such diverse forms of life is what made it so dangerous. It was not species specific. Anything biological could potentially be infected and transformed. Over the years following Marcus's initial breakthrough, umbrella researchers developed numerous T virus strains, each with slightly different properties. Birkin continued refining the virus at the Arklay laboratory throughout the 1980s and 1990s, attempting to solve the intelligence problem. Spencer wanted bioweapons that could follow orders, not mindless zombies that attacked indiscriminately. This led to the development of specialized strains like NET, which was used in the Nemesis project to create BOWs capable of pursuing specific targets. Wesker and Birkin also experimented with combining the T virus with genes from other viruses. They spliced Ebola RNA into the T virus in the late 1970s, creating a variant that could bypass the human immune system more effectively, increasing the survival rate during initial infection and thus increasing the number of zombies produced versus outright deaths. This Ebola T hybrid became one of the most widely used strains in Umbrella's bioweapon program. By the mid-1990s, Umbrella had multiple T virus variants in active development. The Epsilon strain, the VX strain, which could create more aggressive crimson head zombies, and numerous experimental strains tested on human subjects at facilities across the globe. The virus that Marcus had created as a single strain in 1978 had become a family of related pathogens, each with different lethality rates, mutation effects, and tactical applications. But every variant traced back to the same source, the progenitor virus from West African flowers. The leeches Marcus used for genetic splicing, the decade of research he conducted in isolation, the betrayal that killed him, the queen leech that absorbed his corpse and became him again. The T virus's origin is inseparable from the story of James Marcus, brilliant, paranoid, obsessive, murdered, reborn, and eventually destroyed again while his creation outlived him and killed millions. This was never supposed to happen. The Ndapaya kept their flowers secret for centuries, specifically because they understood, at some intuitive level, that what the stairway to the sun contained should not leave their caverns. The virus existed in a natural balance: rare infections, few survivors, controlled cultural transmission through ritual. When Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus dragged progenitor out of its original ecosystem and attempted to weaponize it, they broke that balance. They took an ancient pathogen that had learned to coexist with its host species and twisted it into something that could only destroy. Every zombie that has ever shambled through the streets of Raccoon City traces its lineage back to those caverns in West Africa. Every hunter that has torn apart stars members exist because Marcus combined virus with leech. Every outbreak, every quarantine failure, every city lost to biohazard, all of it stems from three men in 1966 who read a 19th century encyclopedia and decided they could control forces they did not understand. The T virus was not created in a laboratory. It was discovered in flowers that should have remained buried. It was cultivated through betrayal and murder. It was perfected through human experimentation on students who thought they were being trained, not used as test subjects. It was unleashed through revenge by a creature that was no longer human seeking to destroy the company that stole its life. And here is perhaps the most chilling aspect of the T virus's origin. It was entirely predictable. From the moment Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus removed those flowers from the Ndapaya caverns, every subsequent event followed with cold, logical progression. Weaponizing a virus requires testing. Testing requires subjects. Subjects die. Evidence must be hidden. Witnesses must be silenced. Power consolidates around whoever is most ruthless. The scientist who objects dies in a laboratory accident. The scientist who knows too much is assassinated by his students. The students become monsters themselves, continuing the research, creating more viruses, causing more death. There is a common misconception that the T virus origin story is about science going wrong, about good intentions corrupted. This is not accurate. The intentions were never good. Spencer wanted to rule the world through a master race he would create and control. Marcus wanted to overthrow his colleague and claim dominance within Umbrella. Ashford pursued knowledge without considering consequences until consequences killed him. There was no noble goal corrupted. There was only ambition, paranoia, and the willingness to sacrifice others for personal advancement. The T virus is what happens when you give such people access to a mutagenic pathogen and unlimited funding. The flowers were the weapon, the scientists were the delivery system, and humanity became the target, the future of the virus, evolution beyond extinction. The T virus did not end with Raccoon City. That is perhaps the most terrifying truth about Marcus's creation. When the nuclear equivalent thermobaric missiles obliterated Raccoon City on October 1st, 1998, incinerating approximately 100,000 people and reducing the urban center to ash and radiation. Many believed the T virus threat had been contained. The virus had been cauterized, burned out of existence along with everything it had infected. The nightmare was over. They were catastrophically wrong. The T virus survived Raccoon City. Samples existed in laboratories across the globe, stored in freezers and research facilities that Umbrella had established on every continent. When Umbrella Corporation collapsed in 2003, found guilty on all charges related to the Raccoon City disaster, its assets were seized, liquidated, scattered. But bioweapons research does not simply disappear when a company goes bankrupt. The knowledge transfers, the samples transfer. The scientists who created the viruses find new employment with new organizations that have the same goals under different names. Umbrella died, but the T virus lived on, and it evolved. In the years following Raccoon City's destruction, multiple organizations acquired T virus samples and research data. Some were legitimate, governments developing vaccines and defensive countermeasures, preparing for potential bioterrorist attacks. Others were considerably less legitimate, black market weapons dealers, terrorist cells, rogue nations seeking biological weapons programs without the expense of developing their own pathogens from scratch. The T virus became proliferated, disseminated, available to anyone with sufficient funding and connections. But the T virus also became obsolete. By the mid 2000s, researchers recognized that Marcus's creation, revolutionary as it had been in 1978, possessed fundamental limitations that made it ineffective for modern bioweapons development. The zombie outcome was too uncontrollable. The mortality rate was too high. The host intelligence was too degraded. You could not direct a zombie army, could not give them tactical objectives, could not trust them to distinguish between enemies and allies. They simply attacked everything that moved, including each other when no other targets were available. The T virus had proven that biological weapons were viable. What the new generation of virologists needed was something that retained the T virus's mutagenic properties while eliminating its control problems. They needed bioweapons that could think, that could follow orders, that could be deployed strategically rather than just released in the hope that they would kill the right people before being neutralized. This led to the development of successor viruses, each building on the T virus foundation while attempting to solve its inherent flaws. The most significant of these was the C virus, the chrysalid virus, which represented the next major evolution in the viral lineage that began with the stairway to the sunflowers. The C virus was created in 2001 by Dr. Carla Radames, a child prodigy who graduated from university with a doctorate in genetics at age 15. She was recruited immediately by the Simmons Foundation, a powerful organization with deep ties to global intelligence agencies and black operations programs. The foundation assigned her to develop a new generation of bioweapons, giving her access to viral samples and research data that had been acquired during Umbrella's collapse. Radames approached the problem methodically, as she began with the progenitor virus, going back to the original African pathogen that had spawned the T virus and every other Umbrella bioweapon. She then incorporated genetic material from the T. veronica virus, a variant created by Alexia Ashford in the 1980s that had shown the ability to preserve host intelligence during mutation. Finally, she spliced in genes from the G virus, William Birkin's creation that Radames obtained through a sample taken from Sherry Birkin, who had been infected with G virus during the Raccoon City outbreak but survived through treatment. The result was something that combined the best properties of all three predecessor viruses. The C virus could trigger rapid, controlled mutations. It preserved cognitive function in its hosts, allowing them to use weapons, follow complex instructions, and coordinate tactical operations. Most importantly, it could be administered in multiple forms: injection, aerosol, even oral consumption, making it far more versatile than the T virus had ever been. Humans infected with the C virus became creatures called Javo, from the Serbian word for demons. Javo retained enough intelligence to use firearms, operate vehicles, and communicate with each other. Their bodies underwent partial mutation: cracked skin, additional eyes growing on the head, enhanced strength and speed. But they remained recognizably human, at least initially. When a Javo sustained sufficient damage to any part of their body, that specific area would undergo complete mutation, transforming into a specialized weapon. An arm might become a blade or a pincer. A head might become armored or develop sensory organs. The mutations were reactive, adaptive, responding to combat conditions in real time. But the C virus offered even more possibilities. By introducing specific animal DNA during the infection process, Radames could control what type of creature emerged from the mutation. The virus served as a retroviral vector, a biological delivery system that would express whatever genetic instructions were combined with it. This meant that a single virus could produce dozens of different bioweapon variants, each tailored for specific tactical roles. More sinister still was the C virus's use in human cloning. Radam's employer, Derek Simmons, was a high-ranking government official who had become obsessed with the spy Ada Wong. He wanted Radams to create a perfect clone of Wong using C virus transformation. The project required 12,235 attempts. Each previous test subject was injected with a C virus strain that contained Wong's DNA, and each transformed into a deformed mutant that bore only vague resemblance to the original, until Radams herself was forcibly used as the final test subject in April 2009, injected against her will, and transformed into a perfect genetic duplicate of Ada Wong. The transformation stripped away Radam's original identity, overwriting her appearance, her voice, even aspects of her personality with Wong's genetic template. She emerged from the chrysalid, the cocoon stage where C virus mutations occurred, as a perfect replica. For months she believed she was Ada Wong, but eventually her original memories began to resurface, fragmented and traumatic. She remembered being Radam's. She remembered what Simmons had done to her, and she decided that the entire world would pay for that violation. This is where the C virus became truly catastrophic. In 2012 and 2013, Radams orchestrated a series of bioterrorist attacks across multiple countries, using the C virus to create widespread outbreaks designed to destabilize global order. She distributed the virus to the Adonian Liberation Army in Eastern Europe, disguised as nutritional supplements, infecting their soldiers and turning them into Javo. She released an airborne strain at Marhawa Academy in Asia, transforming students and faculty into zombies. She deployed Javo forces in Tall Oaks, United States, and Lansheng, China, creating chaos on 3 continents simultaneously. But Radam's most significant achievement was the enhanced C virus, a variant so powerful that only 3 samples were ever created. This development required the blood of Jake Muller, the son of Albert Wesker. Muller had inherited his father's extraordinary immune system, a genetic trait that made him resistant to viral infection. When Radams captured Muller in Adonia and spent 6 months extracting and analyzing his blood, She discovered that his antibodies could be used to create a C virus strain that bypassed the normal limitations of mutation. The enhanced C virus eliminated the chrysalid stage entirely. Hosts injected with it would transform immediately, without the vulnerable cocoon period. More remarkably, they could mutate continuously, adapting to injuries by developing new forms, shifting between different configurations without cellular breakdown. A host infected with enhanced C virus could theoretically mutate infinitely, becoming progressively more powerful with each transformation, while retaining their intelligence and sense of self. Only 3 people were ever infected with enhanced C virus. Derek Simmons was injected after his plans began unraveling, transforming him into a creature that could shift between 3 different monstrous forms, each more grotesque than the last. Carla Radamas injected herself after being fatally shot, mutating into an enormous, amorphous blob that consumed everything it touched. And Piers Nivens, a BSAA soldier fighting alongside Chris Redfield, deliberately infected himself to gain the power necessary to destroy a massive bioweapon called Chaos, sacrificing his humanity to save his commander. All 3 died. Simmons was killed after days of continuous mutation left him unable to distinguish friend from enemy, his body constantly transforming in response to combat stress. Radams's blob form was destroyed by Ada Wong. Nevins, recognizing that his mutation was irreversible, pushed Chris into an escape pod and used his C virus powers to destroy the entire facility, killing himself in the process. The enhanced C virus demonstrated both the ultimate potential and the ultimate futility of bioweapons development. Here was a virus that could create near invincible mutants, that could grant superhuman abilities without the total loss of consciousness seen in T virus zombies, and yet all it produced was death. The enhanced C virus did not create soldiers or weapons. It created monsters that killed everyone around them and then died themselves, either from combat or from the psychological breakdown that accompanied endless mutation. After the C virus attacks of 2013 were contained, Jake Muller's blood was used to develop anti-C, a vaccine that could neutralize C virus infection. The U.S. government paid Muller his demanded $50 million for the blood samples necessary to mass produce the vaccine. Radams died. Simmons died. Neo Umbrella, the terrorist organization she had built, collapsed. The C virus threat appeared to be over, but again, the virus survived. Samples existed, research data existed, and the fundamental problem that had driven C virus development, the desire for controllable bioweapons, remained unsolved. Future researchers would look at the C virus's achievements and failures and attempt to create something even more refined, even more controllable, even more catastrophic. This is the pattern that has defined the post-T virus world. Each new virus is developed to solve the problems of its predecessor. Each new outbreak demonstrates why biological weapons cannot be controlled, and each new disaster is followed by assurances that this time, finally, the threat has been contained, the samples destroyed, the research terminated, until the next virus emerges and the cycle begins again. The T virus was supposed to create tyrants, intelligent bioweapons that could follow orders. It created zombies instead, mindless, uncontrollable, attacking everything indiscriminately. The C virus was supposed to fix the intelligence problem, creating Javo that could be directed tactically. It created terrorists who used the virus against its creators, turning the bioweapon back on the organizations that developed it. Every attempt to weaponize mutation has produced catastrophe for the weaponizers, and yet the research continues. In the years following the C virus outbreaks, other organizations have pursued their own viral programs. The Connections Crime Syndicate developed the mold, a fungal organism with mutagenic properties similar to viruses but with different transmission vectors and infection methods. Mother Miranda, an Eastern European cult leader, used the mold to create an entire village of mutants in her attempt to resurrect her dead daughter. The bioweapons industry that Umbrella pioneered in the 1960s has metastasized into a global shadow economy where viruses, parasites, and fungal agents are traded like commodities. The T virus itself, Marcus's original creation, still appears occasionally in outbreaks. Terrorist groups acquire old samples from abandoned Umbrella facilities. Black market dealers sell vials to buyers who do not fully understand what they are purchasing. Research laboratories studying bioweapon countermeasures accidentally release containment samples. Each incident produces zombies, the classic T virus outcome, and each is contained with varying levels of success and casualty rates. But the T virus is no longer the cutting edge of bioweapons development. It is almost retro, a vintage plague superseded by more sophisticated pathogens. Modern virologists view the T virus the way weapons engineers view muskets, historically significant, pioneering in its time, but thoroughly obsolete compared to contemporary alternatives. The zombie apocalypse that the T virus promised in Raccoon City has been replaced by more targeted horrors. Javo with tactical awareness. Mold infected humans who can regenerate from almost any injury. Parasites that turn entire populations into mind controlled servants. Yet for all these innovations, none have achieved what Spencer originally envisioned when he read Henry Travis's encyclopedias about the Endopia. None have created the superhuman race that could be controlled and directed. Every virus produces monsters. Every attempt at biological enhancement produces tragedy. The stairway to the sun granted godhood to rare Endopia kings who survived consumption, but modern science has never replicated that success. Every viral transformation in the modern era has produced either zombies, who are effectively dead, or mutants, who lose their humanity even if they retain their intelligence. The future of the T virus and its successor viruses is more outbreaks, more containment failures, more cities quarantined or destroyed, more research facilities developing new variants in the belief that this time will be different, that this strain will finally be controllable, and more researchers dying to the very weapons they create, as Radams did, as Simmons did, as Marcus did decades before them. The T virus's legacy is not the zombie genre it helped popularize, nor the survival horror gameplay it enabled, nor even the specific outbreaks it caused. Its legacy is the proof that biological weapons cannot be controlled once released, that viruses do not recognize political boundaries or strategic objectives, that mutation is chaos, and chaos cannot be harnessed for orderly purposes. Marcus created the T virus to make tyrants. Instead, he created a lesson about hubris, about the impossibility of controlling evolution, about what happens when scientists believe they can weaponize the fundamental processes of life without consequences. That lesson has been taught repeatedly across the decades since 1978. It was taught in Raccoon City in 1998. It was taught in the C virus outbreaks of 2013. It will be taught again in future outbreaks, in future cities, with future viruses developed by future researchers who believe they will succeed where all their predecessors failed. The T virus began in flowers that the Endopia worshipped as sacred and feared as deadly. It will end, if it ever ends, when humanity finally learns what the Endopia knew, that some powers are too dangerous to wield, that some secrets should remain buried, that some doorways, once opened, can never be closed again. Until that lesson is learned, the T virus and its descendants will continue to spread, to mutate, to kill, following the only imperative that viruses understand: infect, replicate, and spread. The Queen Leech that became Marcus wanted revenge on Umbrella. It got that revenge. Umbrella is gone, destroyed by the very virus it tried to control. But the revenge was incomplete because the virus survived. Marcus's creation outlived both Marcus and the company that killed him, and it will outlive everyone who encounters it, because that is what viruses do. They outlive their hosts, they outlive their creators, they persist through every attempt to eliminate them, waiting in frozen samples, in preserved research notes, in the minds of scientists who remember how to recreate them. That is the true origin and the true future of the T virus. Not a beginning or an ending, but a continuous present tense. The virus exists, the virus spreads, the virus kills, the virus persists. From the Endopia caverns to Raccoon City to the global outbreaks of the 2010s and beyond, the pattern remains constant. Humanity discovers or creates a mutagenic pathogen. Humanity attempts to weaponize it. The pathogen escapes. The pathogen kills indiscriminately. Humanity contains the outbreak at enormous cost. And then, inevitably, humanity tries again with a new virus, believing this time will be different. The T virus proved it will never be different. But proving something and learning from that proof are not the same. The lesson remains unlearned. The research continues. And the viruses wait, patient as only biological processes can be patient, for the next outbreak, the next city, the next catastrophe that will follow from humanity's refusal to leave ancient poisons buried where they belong. Understanding this origin is crucial because it informs everything that follows in the Resident Evil timeline. The Raccoon City outbreak in 1998, which killed approximately 100,000 people and required a nuclear strike to contain, happened because the Queen Leech Marcus hybrid released the T virus in revenge. That revenge was possible because Spencer had Marcus assassinated in 1988. That assassination was necessary because Marcus had perfected the T virus in 1978. That perfection was achievable because Spencer forced the Endopia to give up their sacred caverns in 1966. Every death in Raccoon City traces back to flowers in West Africa. Every victim of Umbrella's bioweapons connects to choices made by three men who believed they could control evolution. The T virus is the answer to what happens when you attempt to play God with biological forces that existed millions of years before humans walked the earth. The answer is everyone dies: the scientists who created it, the soldiers deployed against it, the civilians caught in outbreaks, the cities where it spreads. Everyone dies. Eventually, even the virus dies, as it runs out of hosts and collapses under its own lethality. But before it dies, it takes millions with it, and that is the true origin of the T virus, not in scientific innovation or unfortunate accidents, but in the fundamental arrogance of believing that ancient forces can be controlled, weaponized, and deployed without consequences. The Undapaya knew better. They kept the flowers hidden, guarded, sacred. They understood that some things should remain buried in the dark where they evolved, but they could not withstand modern weapons and modern ambition. Their defenses failed. The flowers were taken. The virus was released, and the world has been paying the price ever since. Marcus's greatest achievement was also humanity's greatest curse. The T virus represents the pinnacle of bioweapons development and the nadir of human judgment. It is elegantly designed from a virological perspective: high transmission rate, effective mutation triggers, cross species compatibility, extended host mobility post infection. If your goal is to create the perfect agent of biological warfare, the T virus succeeds brilliantly. It does exactly what it was designed to do: infect, transform, spread, and kill. The problem, of course, is that bioweapons do not recognize the distinction between enemy soldiers and civilian populations. They do not stop at national borders. They do not respond to ceasefire orders. Once released, they follow only viral imperatives: infect, replicate, spread. The T virus does not care about Umbrella's corporate interests, or Spencer's eugenics dreams, or Marcus's revenge. It cares about cellular hijacking and genetic replication. Everything else is human meaning imposed on a biological process that exists beyond human concerns. This is why the T virus ultimately destroyed Umbrella Corporation itself. In 1998, the Arklay laboratory outbreak led to STAR's investigation and the first real evidence of Umbrella's bioweapons program reaching public awareness. In September 1998, the Raccoon City outbreak forced the U.S. government to nuclear strike an American city to contain viral spread. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable. Umbrella's stock price collapsed. Legal proceedings began. In 2003, the company was found guilty on all charges related to the Raccoon City disaster. By 2004, Umbrella Corporation ceased to exist as a functioning entity. Spencer survived the company's fall, went into hiding, and spent his final years as a fugitive before being killed by Albert Wesker in 2006. Marcus was already long dead, killed twice, once by assassination, once in combat as a leech hybrid. Ashford died in 1968. The three founders of Umbrella, the three men who brought Progenitor out of Africa, are all dead. Their company is dead. Their eugenics project collapsed. Their bioweapons were used against them by former employees. The T virus they created turned on its creators and consumed them. But the virus itself survives. Samples exist in facilities across the world, kept by governments and corporations for research purposes, for potential vaccine development, for defensive bioweapons programs. The knowledge of how to create it has been disseminated through stolen research data, through defecting scientists, through black market trafficking. The T virus cannot be uninvented. It cannot be forgotten. It will always exist now, a permanent addition to humanity's arsenal of ways to destroy itself. And it all began with flowers in a cave, worshipped by a people who understood that some poisons are too powerful to wield, that some mutations are too dangerous to pursue, that some secrets are kept secret for good reason. The Endopia tried to protect the world from the stairway to the sun. They failed. And so we live in a world where the T virus exists, where future outbreaks are not just possible but probable, where the ancient pathogen that granted godhood to Stone Age kings has been twisted into a weapon that grants only death. The true origin of the T virus is not a date, or a place, or a scientific formula. It is a choice. The choice to take what should not be taken, to weaponize what should not be weaponized, to believe that human intelligence can master forces that operated before intelligence evolved. That choice was made in 1966 when Spencer, Ashford, and Marcus entered the Endopia caverns. Every subsequent event follows from that choice: Marcus's assassination, the Queen Leech's revenge, the Raccoon City outbreak, the millions dead from T virus infections worldwide. All of it traces back to three men who looked at flowers that killed most who consumed them and thought, we can use this. They were right. They could use it. The T virus worked exactly as designed. It infected, it mutated, it killed, it created bioweapons of staggering effectiveness. And in doing so, it proved that just because something can be done does not mean it should be done. Just because a virus can be weaponized does not mean weaponizing it is wise. Just because power can be seized does not mean seizing it will lead anywhere but to destruction. The Endapaya's sacred flowers became humanity's curse. The stairway to the sun, which they climbed toward potential divinity, became a descent into hell for millions. The virus that granted superhuman abilities to rare survivors granted only suffering to everyone else. And at the bottom of it all, beneath the outbreaks and the zombie hordes and the corporate conspiracies and the government cover-ups, there is this simple fact: it did not have to happen. The flowers could have remained hidden. The virus could have stayed contained in its original ecosystem. The caverns could have remained sacred and sealed, but they did not. And so the T virus exists, and so the world must live with that existence, knowing that somewhere, in some laboratory, samples of Marcus's creation are stored and studied and potentially weaponized again. The origin of the T virus is the origin of a nightmare that has no ending, only containment, only management, only the hope that the next outbreak can be stopped before it spreads too far. Sleep well with that knowledge. Sleep knowing that ancient poisons, once released, cannot be put back. Sleep knowing that the T virus is real within its fiction, and the impulses that created it, ambition, paranoia, the desire to control nature, are very real in our world. The stairway to the sunflowers may be fictional, but the mindset that would harvest them, study them, weaponize them, and unleash them exists in laboratories and military installations across our actual planet. The T virus is a warning written in bass pairs and zombie moans, a warning that we have the capacity to create horrors beyond imagination when we prioritize power over wisdom, ambition over caution, profit over safety. Marcus created the T virus, but we create the conditions that allow men like Marcus, Spencer, and Ashford to pursue such research. We fund the corporations. We fight the wars that require bioweapons. We accept the logic that says some research is too important to stop, even when that research might kill us all. The true origin of the T virus is humanity's inability to leave dangerous things alone, to see a poisonous flower and think, I should eat that, to see a lethal virus and think, I should weaponize that, to see a civilization destroyed by biological horror and think, but I will control it better. That impulse, that arrogance, that certainty that this time will be different, that this time we will maintain control, that is where the T virus comes from. Not from Africa or leeches or laboratories, but from the part of human nature that always thinks it can handle forces it does not understand. The T virus is what happens when that certainty meets reality, when the controlled experiment escapes containment, when the bioweapon infects its creators, when the line between research and catastrophe disappears because it was never as solid as the scientists believed. Marcus thought he controlled the T virus. He died with his face being eaten by his own leeches. Spencer thought he controlled Umbrella. He died hunted and alone. The Endapaya thought they could protect their secrets. Their civilization was destroyed, their people displaced, their sacred caverns ransacked. No one controlled anything. The virus controlled them. And now, in the fiction of Resident Evil's universe, it continues to spread, to mutate, to create new horrors from old DNA, because that is what viruses do. They do not stop. They do not negotiate. They do not care about human intentions or human suffering. They simply replicate, infect, transform, and spread. That is the origin of the T virus. Not a beginning, but an opening of a door that can never be closed again. Shinji Mikami worked solo for 6 months before Resident Evil became a franchise, before it defined survival horror, before anyone knew what it would become. It was just Shinji Mikami sitting in a development room by himself. The game that would eventually launch in March of 1996 began development in 1993. For the first 6 months of that 3 year development cycle, Mikami worked completely alone on the project. No team and no assistants. Just one person trying to figure out how to make a video game that wasn't Sweet Home. Capcom eventually granted him a small team that slowly grew over the next 3 years, but those initial 6 months were solitary. Every foundational decision about what Resident Evil would become passed through a single creative consciousness. The mansion layout, the basic gameplay loop, the tone, the atmosphere, all of it incubated in isolation before other voices entered the process. This fact matters because it explains the singular vision that defines the first game. Resident Evil feels coherent, feels like it knows exactly what it wants to be, because for those crucial early months it was shaped by one person's specific nightmares and inspirations rather than committee decisions or focus group testing. The game was originally meant to be Sweet Home 2. Resident Evil began life as something else entirely. In 1989, Capcom released Sweet Home, a horror RPG for the Famicom based on a Japanese horror film of the same name. The game trapped players in a haunted mansion where they had to solve puzzles, manage limited inventory, deal with permadeath, and survive encounters with ghosts and monsters. It was only released in Japan due to its graphic content, but it laid groundwork that Capcom wanted to explore further. When Takuro Fujiwara told Shinji Mikami to create a game using elements from Sweet Home, the initial plan was a straight remake or spiritual sequel. As development progressed, particularly after the shift from Super Nintendo to PlayStation, the project evolved away from its RPG roots towards something new, but the DNA remained. The mansion setting came from Sweet Home. The emphasis on puzzle solving came from Sweet Home. The scattered documents that tell environmental stories came from Sweet Home. The tension between exploration and danger came from Sweet Home. Even the infamous door loading screens that became a Resident Evil signature were inherited from Sweet Home's need to mask loading times on primitive hardware. The evolution from Sweet Home remake to original property happened gradually, almost accidentally, but without Sweet Home's foundation, Resident Evil as we know it wouldn't exist. Every survival horror game that followed owes a debt to a Japan exclusive Famicom RPG that most Western players have never experienced. The name change was forced by legal issues. In Japan, Resident Evil is called Biohazard. This isn't just a translation choice. It was the original title for the game globally when marketing executives prepared to release Biohazard in North America. They discovered a problem. A DOS game called Biohazard had already been released and trademarked in the United States. Additionally, a New York hardcore punk band called Biohazard was also using the name. Securing rights would be expensive, complicated, possibly impossible. Capcom's North American offices held an internal contest among company personnel to choose a new name. Employees submitted suggestions, and from these submissions, Resident Evil was selected. The name references the mansion setting, the Spencer Mansion, as a residence of evil, inhabited by evil, made evil by what occurred within its walls. It's a solid name, evocative without being overly literal, but it wasn't the first choice. It was a compromise born from legal necessity. Director Shinji Mikami and Capcom Japan weren't thrilled about the change. They preferred Biohazard, felt it better captured the biological threat at the game's core. But the legal realities won. Ever since, the franchise has existed with dual identities: Biohazard in Japan, Resident Evil everywhere else. This split creates interesting artifacts. Resident Evil 7 carries the subtitle Biohazard in Western releases, while the Japanese version is titled Biohazard 7 Resident Evil, with the 7 cleverly designed to work within both names. The first version was going to be first person. The fixed camera angles and third person perspective that became synonymous with Resident Evil weren't part of the original vision. Early in development, Resident Evil was planned as a first person experience. Concept art and blurry prototype footage show a first person perspective with more supernatural elements rather than the biological horror the series became famous for. The development team cited technical difficulties for abandoning the first person approach. The PlayStation hardware had limitations, and maintaining atmosphere in first person proved challenging with the available technology. More significantly, director Shinji Mikami encountered Alone in the Dark, which used third person perspective with fixed camera angles to create tension and control player viewpoint. That game demonstrated how limiting player perspective could actually enhance horror rather than diminish it. The shift to third person with fixed cameras became one of Resident Evil's defining features. Those angles controlled what players could see, hid threats just off screen, created awkward transitions that left players vulnerable. The famous dog through the window jump scare in the Spencer Mansion works specifically because of camera positioning. In first person, players would see the window approaching and brace for something. With fixed cameras, the surprise arrives from outside the frame, unexpected and visceral. Ironically, the series would eventually embrace first person perspective, with Resident Evil 7 in 2017, 21 years after abandoning it. But by then, technology and design philosophy had evolved enough to make first person horror work in ways the PlayStation couldn't support in 1993. Co op mode was cut from the first game. The original Resident Evil was intended to feature cooperative multiplayer. Footage and screenshots from a 1995 demo showed both Chris and Jill exploring the Spencer Mansion simultaneously, fighting zombies together. This would have predated the co-op survival horror that Resident Evil 5 and 6 would eventually embrace by over a decade. The feature was scrapped because the PlayStation couldn't handle it. Mikami himself admitted the co-op gameplay wasn't good enough. The hardware struggled to render two characters on screen with acceptable performance. Enemies became less threatening with two players fighting them, and the resource scarcity that created tension broke down when two players could share supplies. The decision to cut co-op fundamentally shaped what Resident Evil became. Horror works best in isolation. A second player provides comfort, turns fear into a social experience rather than a personal one. Playing Resident Evil alone in a dark room creates vulnerability that co-op eliminates. The developers learned this lesson early, and it influenced survival horror design for years. Some games work cooperatively, Left 4 Dead, the later RE titles, but the peak dread moments in horror gaming almost always occur when you're alone. The Game Boy Color version was 90% complete. Capcom attempted to port the original Resident Evil to the Game Boy Color. This seems insane given the hardware limitations. The Game Boy Color's tiny screen, limited color palette, and minimal processing power make it an absurd platform for a game built around cinematic presentation and detailed, pre-rendered backgrounds. But Capcom tried anyway, and they got surprisingly far. The Game Boy Color version reached 90% completion before Capcom canceled it. The official statement claimed they were not confident the product would have made both consumers and Capcom happy. This is corporate speak, for it looked and played terribly. Rudimentary footage exists showing the game running on Game Boy Color hardware, and while technically impressive as a programming feat, it's nearly unplayable. The tiny screen makes navigation difficult, enemy encounters are hard to parse, and the atmosphere that makes Resident Evil work simply can't translate to handheld hardware from that era. An enthusiast eventually obtained the unfinished game and released it as a ROM online, allowing anyone with an emulator to experience this bizarre artifact. It's fascinating as a historical curiosity, proof that developers will attempt remarkable feats of adaptation even when common sense suggests they shouldn't. But it's also a relief that Capcom canceled it, because releasing that version might have damaged the franchise's reputation when it was still establishing itself. The voice acting had no Japanese track originally. The English voice acting in the original Resident Evil is legendarily bad. Jill Sandwich became a meme. You were almost a Jill Sandwich. The line readings are stiff, the dialogue is awkward, and the performances suggest actors who had no context for what kind of game they were in. Western players assumed this was just cheap export work, that a superior Japanese voice track existed. It didn't. Japanese voice acting was recorded for the original release, but director Shinji Mikami scrapped it due to poor quality. Little did he know the English replacement would become equally infamous. The production was rushed. American actors were flown to Japan late in development, given minimal takes for each scene, often just two, and worked with a minuscule budget. The result is charming in its awfulness, unintentionally funny in ways that actually enhance the game's appeal. Mikami and the development team liked the idea of keeping dialogue entirely in English. Subsequent games didn't bother attempting Japanese voice tracks until Resident Evil Revelations in 2012, 16 years later. For over a decade and a half, Resident Evil remained an English-only franchise in terms of voice acting, with Japanese players reading subtitles. This decision gave the series a distinctly Western horror movie aesthetic, imitating the B-movies and George Romero zombie films that inspired it. Chris's costume references, Queen's final album character costumes in the Resident Evil series contain hidden references that most players never notice. Chris Redfield's alternate costume jacket in the first game reads, "Made in Heaven," a reference to Queen's 1995 album of the same name. This wasn't a one-time Easter egg. Claire Redfield's jacket in Resident Evil 2 bears a similar design with the same reference. The jacket even appears in Chris's office in both Resident Evil 2 and 3. Code Veronica continues the pattern, though Claire's jacket in that game reads "Let Me Live" instead, which is the third track on Made in Heaven. Billy Cohen's tattoo in Resident Evil 0 translates to "Mother Love," the album's fourth track. Someone on the development team clearly loved Queen's final album and found ways to weave references throughout multiple games spanning years of development. These details are so subtle that most players never consciously register them, but they demonstrate the care put into character design. The developers weren't just slapping generic outfits on characters, they were embedding personal touches, cultural references, specific artistic choices that give the world texture even when players don't explicitly recognize them. It's world building through accumulation of small, seemingly insignificant details that collectively create authenticity. The Spencer Mansion was based on real European estates. Tatsuya Minami, senior manager of product planning for Resident Evil, revealed in 1996 that the mansions used in the games were based on actual structures and development. Team visited. They specifically sought out locations that creeped them out, not just aesthetically impressive buildings, but places with genuine atmosphere, with the capacity to unsettle. The team traveled to America and England multiple times, visiting stately homes in the countryside. Minami mentioned feeling quite frightened in some of these locations. They chose European estates specifically because those architectural styles possess strong backgrounds and inherent eerie qualities that Japanese or American residential architecture lacked. The ornate details, the aged wood and stone, the sprawling layouts with hidden passages, these weren't video game inventions but adaptations of real architectural features. This explains why the Spencer Mansion feels so believable despite its absurd puzzle based security systems. The underlying structure, the aesthetic choices, the spatial relationships all derive from actual buildings. The developers photographed textures, studied layouts, absorbed the atmosphere of genuinely unsettling places, and then translated that experience into pre rendered backgrounds. When you feel uncomfortable in the mansion, you're responding to design choices grounded in locations that made professional game developers uncomfortable in real life. The cover art model wasn't Chris. The iconic cover art for the original Resident Evil shows a lone figure in combat vest and clothing, armed with a shotgun, facing unknown horrors. For years, fans assumed this was Chris Redfield, one of the game's two protagonists. The clothing is similar to Chris's outfit. The weapon matches what he uses, and featuring a protagonist on the cover made logical marketing sense. It wasn't Chris. The model was just a generic soldier, chosen for visual impact rather than narrative accuracy. This wasn't uncommon in the era. Game covers frequently featured artwork only tangentially related to actual game content, but it created an interesting disconnect between marketing and game, established an aesthetic identity for the series that didn't quite match what players encountered. The cover art became iconic anyway, defining the series' visual identity in many ways more than screenshots or actual character designs. That lone figure facing unseen threats, outnumbered and outgunned, but determined to survive, captured the essence of what Resident Evil was about, even if it wasn't literally depicting the game. Sometimes the spirit of something matters more than factual accuracy. Fact 11. Resident Evil 2 was completely restarted. Resident Evil 2 had a long, troubled development. A complete version of the game was made and nearly released, but Capcom's development team looked at what they'd created and decided it wasn't good enough. They scrapped nearly everything and started over, keeping only key plot elements like the zombie outbreak in Raccoon City and rookie cop Leon S. Kennedy as a protagonist. This prototype became known as Resident Evil 1.5 among fans. Instead of Claire Redfield, it featured a playable character named Elza Walker, a college student and motorcycle racer. The game was significantly different in tone, setting, and structure. Substantial footage and information about 1.5 exists because the project reached advanced stages before cancellation. It wasn't an early prototype, but a mostly complete game deemed unworthy of release. The decision to restart development demonstrates extraordinary commitment to quality. Many companies would have released what they had, particularly given the first game's success creating pressure for a sequel. But Capcom chose to absorb the financial loss, delay the release, and build a better game from scratch. Resident Evil 2 eventually launched in January 1998, becoming one of the most acclaimed entries in the franchise. Without that painful mid-development reset, we might have received a mediocre sequel that damaged the series' reputation instead of cemented it. The complete development story of Resident Evil 2 took nearly 4 years, far longer than typical for the era. That time resulted in a superior product, but it also established a pattern of lengthy, troubled development cycles that would haunt future entries, particularly Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 3 was originally a side story. The game we know as Resident Evil 3, Nemesis, wasn't originally intended to be a numbered entry. During late 1990s development, multiple Resident Evil projects were in production simultaneously. One was a side story set in Raccoon City involving civilians trying to escape the outbreak. Another was Code Veronica for the Dreamcast, which was planned as the true sequel to Resident Evil 2. A third project, directed by Hideki Kamiya, was a proper Resident Evil 3 that would star Hunk on a cruise ship. Kamiya's version was canceled, or rather retooled into something else entirely. It became the foundation for Devil May Cry. With the numbered sequel slot suddenly open and the side story project looking promising, Capcom made a business decision. They upgraded the Raccoon City escape game to main entry status, gave it the number 3, and positioned Code Veronica as a side game despite its more direct narrative continuation of Resident Evil 2's story. Why? Money. Numbered entries sell better than side stories. Attaching 3 to the game would boost sales, while Code Veronica could survive as a Dreamcast exclusive without the mainline number. This purely commercial decision created ongoing confusion about the series' narrative chronology, with Code Veronica being more of a true Resident Evil 3 in terms of story importance despite lacking the number. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis launched for PlayStation in September 1999, about 8 months after Resident Evil 2. The quick turnaround was possible because it repurposed many assets from RE2, essentially functioning as an expanded side story even after receiving numbered entry status. Meanwhile, Code Veronica arrived on Dreamcast in February 2000, providing a more substantial continuation of Claire and Chris's stories, but forever marked as not mainline by its lack of number. Nemesis was inspired by Terminator 2. The Nemesis creature that pursues Jill Valentine through Resident Evil 3 didn't emerge from biological horror alone. It was explicitly designed to replicate the relentless pursuit dynamic from Terminator 2, Judgment Day. The T-1000's unstoppable chase through that film created persistent tension that the developers wanted to capture in game form. Nemesis appears throughout the game, seemingly killed multiple times but always returning, increasingly mutated and desperate. The creature can use weapons, rocket launchers, flamethrowers, giving it tactical intelligence beyond typical bioweapons. It speaks, albeit only able to say STRS as it hunts Jill, one of the surviving STRS members from the Spencer Mansion incident. This vocal capability makes it more unsettling than silent monsters, suggesting consciousness and purpose rather than pure instinct. The encounter design revolves around decision points where players choose to fight or flee. Fighting Nemesis usually provides rewards but costs ammunition and health. Fleeing preserves resources but means missing out on powerful items. This risk-reward calculation creates tension distinct from standard enemy encounters, forcing players to weigh immediate safety against long-term survival. Nemesis became iconic specifically because of how effectively it captured that Terminator 2 dynamic. The creature influenced countless games afterward, Mr. X and Resident Evil 2 Remake, The Baker family in Resident Evil 7, Lady Dimitrescu in Resident Evil Village all build on the foundation Nemesis established. The stalker enemy subgenre in survival horror essentially began with Resident Evil 3's implementation of Terminator 2's core tension. Code Veronica features the longest time span. While Resident Evil 3 takes place during September 26, October 1st, 1998, Code Veronica actually spans December 1998 through its conclusion, giving it the longest in-game time period in the classic series. This extended timeline allows for more significant character development and plot progression than games confined to a few frantic days. The game follows Claire Redfield's continued search for her brother Chris, taking her from infiltrating an Umbrella facility in Paris to being imprisoned on Rockford Island, then to an Antarctic research station. Chris eventually joins as a second playable character after Claire's distress signal reaches him. The siblings finally reunite and work together to escape, providing narrative closure their separate games couldn't deliver. Code Veronica introduced several innovations. It was the first Resident Evil game to use real-time 3D backgrounds instead of pre-rendered images, allowing for dynamic camera movement. The game features more polished voice acting and cinematic direction than previous entries. It expanded the series' mythology significantly, introducing the Ashford family and their role in Umbrella's founding, the T. Veronica virus as a distinct threat, and Wesker's survival and superhuman transformation. Despite technically being a side entry, Code Veronica often receives praise as the real Resident Evil 3 in terms of story importance and production values. Its relegation to non-numbered status was purely circumstantial. The game was developed for Dreamcast, a platform with a smaller install base than PlayStation, while Resident Evil 3 was designed for PlayStation's massive market share. Numbers followed commercial strategy rather than narrative importance. Resident Evil 4 had 4 different versions. Resident Evil 4's development cycle remains one of the most chaotic in gaming history. The game that eventually launched in January 2005 was the 4th complete version developed. Each previous iteration was either canceled or retooled into different games, with only the final attempt becoming the Resident Evil 4 players know. The first version, sometimes called the stylish build, featured Leon infiltrating a European castle to fight living dolls and supernatural threats. The tone was too far from Resident Evil's biological horror roots, so this version was retooled into Devil May Cry, spawning an entirely new franchise that Capcom still produces today. The second version, known as the Castle build, retained the castle setting but introduced more horror elements. This iteration featured enemies called Hookmen pursuing Leon through gothic environments. It was deemed too supernatural and horror-focused, even for Resident Evil, so it became Haunting Ground, another survival horror game that released for PlayStation 2 in 2005. The third version introduced the progenitor virus concept, where Leon would gradually succumb to infection, experiencing hallucinations and losing control. Ghosts haunted him through the game, with his mental state deteriorating as the virus spread. This version got further in development than previous attempts, but was ultimately scrapped for being too depressing and removing player agency as Leon's condition worsened. The fourth version, what we know as Resident Evil 4, retained the over-the-shoulder camera from the Hookman iteration, but replaced supernatural elements with Las Plagas parasites. The setting shifted to rural Spain. The tone became more action-oriented, and Leon transformed from damaged rookie cop into confident special agent. This version finally satisfied developers and publishers. launching to massive critical and commercial success that redefined action games for years. The 7 year development cycle from initial concept to final release demonstrates the difficulty of evolving an established franchise. Each attempt explored different directions, tested different ideas, and ultimately contributed something to other games, even when it couldn't work for Resident Evil 4 itself. The canceled versions weren't wasted effort. They became Devil May Cry, Haunting Ground, and Onimusha's design DNA, while Resident Evil 4 eventually found its identity. The merchant's voice actor improvised lines. The mysterious merchant in Resident Evil 4, who appears in improbable locations selling weapons and supplies, has one of gaming's most quoted lines, "What are you buying?" This became so iconic that Resident Evil Village's merchant character, the Duke, references it directly, calling it something an old friend used to say. The merchant's voice actor, Paul Mercier, improvised many of the character's lines. The script provided basic dialogue, but Mercier added personality, emphasis, and character that transformed a simple gameplay function into a memorable NPC. His delivery of "Not enough cash, stranger" or "Come back anytime" became as recognizable as any main character's dialogue. This improvisation exemplifies how voice actors contribute to games beyond simply reading scripts. The merchant could have been functional, but forgettable. Instead, Mercier created a character players genuinely looked forward to encountering, someone whose presence provided comic relief in an otherwise tense game. The merchant became merchandise, appeared in other Capcom games as a reference, and inspired similar characters in countless games afterward. Mercier also voiced Leon S. Kennedy in Resident Evil 4, performing both the protagonist and this recurring side character. This created an interesting dynamic where Leon's dry professionalism contrasted sharply with the merchant's exuberant salesmanship, both emerging from the same actor's vocal range. The dual performance demonstrates Mercier's versatility and commitment to making each role distinct despite sharing recording sessions. Ashley's ballistics joke was in the original Resident Evil 4 contains a hidden interaction that many players miss. During the castle section, Leon can use a telescope to look at various points of interest. If players angle the camera to look down at Ashley Graham, the president's daughter Leon is protecting, she catches him and responds with, "Hey, perv," followed by crossing her arms. In the GameCube version, there's an achievement trophy associated with this called ballistics. This isn't just sophomore humor, it's character development. Ashley has agency and personality. She calls out inappropriate behavior rather than passively accepting objectification. The interaction is completely optional, requires player initiative to trigger, and punishes that choice with social consequences rather than rewarding it. It's a small moment that gives Ashley dimensionality beyond her role as escort mission objective. The remake kept this interaction, updating it slightly but maintaining the spirit. Some fans worried the remake would remove content deemed problematic by modern standards, but Capcom recognized this moment works specifically because Ashley responds negatively. It's not fan service, it's character establishing boundaries, which actually makes her more likable and human rather than less. This detail exemplifies Resident Evil 4's approach to tone. The game is simultaneously serious and playful, dramatic and self-aware. It can feature intense action sequences and grotesque horror, while also including moments like Ashley commenting on Leon's apparent voyeurism. That tonal balance, walking the line between camp and genuine horror, defines why Resident Evil 4 works when other games trying similar approaches fail. Resident Evil 5's boulder punching scene was motion captured. Resident Evil 5 contains one of gaming's most mimetic moments: Chris Redfield punching a boulder into lava during the final boss fight. This absurdly over-the-top action became instant internet comedy, spawning countless jokes about Chris's apparent superhuman strength and spawning the meme boulder punching asshole that Resident Evil Village directly references. What makes this funnier is that the scene was fully motion captured. A performer actually enacted the motions of punching a boulder, complete with the exaggerated wind-up, the impacts, the final triumphant shove. Someone was directed to physically perform these ridiculous actions, probably while wearing a motion capture suit covered in tracking markers, possibly with observers watching and providing notes on technique. The scene exemplifies Resident Evil 5's commitment to action over horror. The game embraced power fantasy, transforming Chris from vulnerable survivor in the first game into a boulder-punching action hero. This direction proved divisive. Some players loved the increased action. Others felt the series had lost its survival horror identity. The boulder scene became a flashpoint for this debate, perfectly encapsulating everything people either loved or hated about Resident Evil 5's approach. Roger Craig Smith, Chris's voice actor for Resident Evil 5 and multiple subsequent appearances, noted in interviews that fans frequently bring Boulder-related merchandise for him to sign at conventions. He's bemused by the scene's legacy, understanding it represents both the game's commitment to spectacle and its departure from horror fundamentals. Resident Evil 6 was the series' biggest budget. Resident Evil 6 carried the largest budget in the franchise's history, with Capcom investing extraordinary resources into a game meant to appeal to the broadest possible audience. The game featured 4 interconnected campaigns starring different characters: Leon, Chris, Jake and Sherry, and Ada, with each campaign taking stylistic cues from different genres. Leon's campaign attempted survival horror, evoking earlier games. Chris's campaign was military action, building on Resident Evil 5's co-op shooter mechanics. Jake's campaign mixed action with stealth and chase sequences. Ada's campaign, initially downloadable content and later included in all versions, focused on solo play and exploration. This attempt to please everyone resulted in a game that felt unfocused, unable to excel at any particular approach because it divided attention across too many styles. The game's sprawling ambition showed in its scope. It featured more playable characters than any previous entry, more locations spanning multiple continents, more enemy types, more weapon variety, more set pieces, more cutscenes. The campaign lengths totaled over 20 hours across all 4 stories, making it one of the longest Resident Evil games. Production values were extraordinary, with some of gaming's most elaborate action sequences and cinematic direction. Critical and fan reception was mixed to negative. The game felt bloated, unfocused, too long without sufficient variation to justify its length. The attempt to be everything to everyone resulted in an identity crisis. Capcom expected Resident Evil 6 to be the series' peak, commercially and critically. Instead, it prompted a reassessment of what Resident Evil should be, ultimately leading to Resident Evil 7's dramatic shift back towards survival horror. Despite its reception, Resident Evil 6 sold well, moving over 7 million copies. The financial success masked creative failure, demonstrating the disconnect between commercial performance and artistic achievement. Games can sell millions and still be considered disappointing, particularly when they represent the culmination of a beloved franchise's direction. Resident Evil 7 was revealed as Kitchen Resident Evil 7's first public appearance wasn't at a major gaming press conference or in a traditional trailer. It was revealed at E3 2015 as a mysterious VR demo called Kitchen. Players wearing PlayStation VR headsets experienced a first person horror scenario set in a derelict kitchen, with no indication this was connected to Resident Evil. The demo featured a player trapped in a kitchen, hands bound, watching a door across the room. Eventually, someone enters with frightening implications. The experience was viscerally unsettling in VR, using the medium's immersion to create claustrophobic horror that traditional screens couldn't match. Speculation ran wild about what game this demo represented. Only later did Capcom reveal Kitchen was Resident Evil 7. The number 7, cleverly hidden in KI7CHEN, was the clue nobody initially caught. This unconventional reveal generated substantial buzz precisely because it was mysterious. Rather than announcing, "Here's the new Resident Evil," Capcom let players experience something disturbing and wonder what it meant. When the connection became clear, the conversation was already happening. This marketing approach reflected Resident Evil 7's dramatic reimagining. After Resident Evil 6's unfocused action, Capcom wanted to signal a complete tonal reset. Starting with an enigmatic VR demo communicated that message more effectively than any traditional trailer. The game would be unfamiliar, unsettling, a departure from established patterns. Kitchen set those expectations before anyone knew what they were looking at. Resident Evil 7 launched in January 2017 with full VR support on PlayStation VR, the first mainline Resident Evil game designed for virtual reality. The VR version amplified the horror significantly, placing players directly in the Baker house with 360-degree awareness of threats. Reviews praised the VR implementation as one of the medium's best horror experiences, validating the risk of building the game with VR in mind from the beginning. Ethan Winters is dead the whole time. Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village both star Ethan Winters, an everyman protagonist who survives extraordinary circumstances through determination and luck. Except Ethan isn't surviving at all. He's been dead since the beginning of Resident Evil 7, reanimated by the mold that permeates the Baker estate. This revelation comes gradually through both games. Ethan's remarkable healing abilities, his capacity to reattach severed limbs, his survival of injuries that should be fatal, all point toward something wrong with his physiology. Lady Dimitrescu comments that Ethan's blood is stale when she drinks it in Village. The truth is finally confirmed near Village's conclusion. Ethan died early in Resident Evil 7 during his confrontation with Jack Baker, and the mold reanimated him as a sentient colony masquerading as human. This reframes both games entirely. Ethan isn't a lucky survivor. He's already a victim, already dead, sustained by the same force that created the molded enemies he fights. His apparent resurrection at RE7's end wasn't medical recovery, but mold maintaining the illusion of his humanity. Everything after that point is a dead man walking, unaware of his own state. The reveal adds tragic dimension to Ethan's sacrifice at the end of Village. He doesn't give his life to save his daughter Rose. He's already lost his life. What he sacrifices is his continuity, choosing to finally let go rather than persist, as mold wearing his face. His final moments gain weight from this knowledge, transforming a heroic sacrifice into something sadder and more complex. Clues to Ethan's status exist throughout both games for attentive players. His face is never clearly shown in either game, always obscured or just off screen. This isn't just stylistic choice. It's narrative hint that something is wrong with Ethan, that he isn't quite what he appears. The games hide this fact until the proper dramatic moment, but the evidence was always there. Lady Dimitrescu's height was a late design choice. Alcina Dimitrescu, known as Lady Dimitrescu, became an unexpected internet phenomenon before Resident Evil Village even launched. Her towering height, elegant dress, and predatory grace captured attention, spawning fan art, cosplay, and thirst posting that dominated gaming discourse for months. Capcom didn't anticipate this reaction because her height wasn't originally part of the character design. Early concept art shows Dimitrescu at more human proportions, around 6 feet tall rather than 9.5. The exaggerated height came later in development as designers emphasized her intimidating presence. They wanted a stalker enemy that felt physically dominating, someone who couldn't be easily escaped or fought. Making her impossibly tall achieved this while also reinforcing the fairy tale atmosphere of her castle setting. The height works on multiple levels. Practically, it makes her an imposing chase enemy. She towers over Ethan, forcing players to look up at her in encounters, creating psychological vulnerability. Thematically, it evokes Gothic horror's tradition of transgressive bodies, creatures that violate natural law. Sexually, it plays into specific kinks that a substantial portion of players apparently possess, though Capcom's market research somehow missed this. Maggie Robertson, the actress who performed Lady Dimitrescu's voice and motion capture, stands 6 feet tall herself. Capcom cast her specifically for her height, wanting the physical performance to inform the character's movement. Robertson studied how tall people move differently, how they have to adjust for spaces not designed for their size, and brought that awareness to her performance. The result is a character whose height feels integrated into her being rather than merely a visual gimmick. The cultural response to Lady Dimitrescu demonstrates gaming's unpredictability. Characters designed to be frightening can become objects of attraction. Villains can become more popular than heroes. A monster who murders people can become a fan favorite, specifically because of design choices meant to make her intimidating. Marketing can't manufacture these responses. They emerge organically from how players engage with characters in ways developers can't predict or control. The Duke is invincible. The Duke, Resident Evil Village's merchant, serves the same gameplay function as Resident Evil 4's mysterious merchant. He appears in improbable locations throughout the game, providing a shop interface for buying and selling equipment. Unlike Resident Evil 4's merchant, who would become hostile if attacked, the Duke is completely invulnerable to harm. Players discovered this through experimentation, shooting the Duke, throwing explosives at him, attacking him with any weapon produces no effect. He laughs off the assault, treating it as play rather than genuine threat. No matter what Ethan does, the Duke remains unharmed and cheerful, his shop interface always available. This invincibility raises interesting questions about who or what the Duke actually is. He clearly isn't human. His impossible mobility, his knowledge of events he shouldn't know about, his imperviousness to harm all suggests something supernatural or beyond normal understanding. The game never explains the Duke's nature, leaving him as mysterious as Resident Evil 4's merchant. The decision to make the Duke invulnerable likely stems from avoiding problematic scenarios. If the Duke could be hurt, players might kill him and lock themselves out of necessary upgrades. If he became hostile when attacked, as in some games, players might accidentally trigger permanent aggression through stray shots. Making him completely invincible solves these problems while reinforcing his mysterious nature. This detail exemplifies Resident Evil Village's fairy tale logic. The game openly embraces supernatural elements more than previous entries with werewolves, vampires, witches, and other fairy tale monsters sharing space with scientific explanations. The Duke fits this approach. He's a magical merchant figure who exists because the story needs him, with no particular concern for logical explanation. That's fine. Sometimes games benefit from embracing abstraction over realism. Rose's Age. Jump at the ending. Resident Evil Village's ending features a significant time jump that many players don't immediately realize. After Ethan's sacrifice, the game cuts to Rose Winters visiting her father's grave. She appears to be in her late teens or early 20s, suggesting the final scene takes place at least 15, 16 years after the main game's events. This time jump sets up obvious sequel possibilities. Rose has grown up with unusual abilities from the mold's influence. The mysterious figure approaching her vehicle in the distance suggests new threats emerging. The ending functions as both closure for Ethan's story and setup for Rose as a potential protagonist in future games. What makes this interesting is how the game handles the jump. There's no narration explaining years passing, no title card reading 16 years later. Players are simply shown an older Rose, expected to understand time has passed. Some players missed this entirely, thinking Rose was still a child, confused by why she was driving a car or discussing adult concepts. The subtle approach respects player intelligence while creating space for interpretation. How much time passed exactly? What has Rose been doing during those years? What happened to Chris and other surviving characters? The game doesn't answer these questions, allowing imagination to fill gaps rather than over explaining everything. The pink herb exists in RE0's code. Resident Evil games feature various herbs for healing. Green herbs restore health. Red herbs have no effect alone but enhance green herbs when combined. And blue herbs cure poison. This system appeared in the first game and became a series staple, but in Resident Evil Zero's game files, there's a fourth herb color, pink. The pink herb exists completely within the game's code, but was never implemented in any functional capacity. If accessed through hacking or cheating, the pink herb appears in inventory, but does nothing when used. No documentation explains what the pink herb was supposed to do, why it was cut, or how far into development it went before removal. Theories abound. Perhaps it was meant to cure a status effect that was cut from the game. Perhaps it would have provided a unique buff or ability. Perhaps it was simply an experiment that didn't work out. Without developer commentary, the pink herb remains a mystery, an artifact of development that made it into final code without any actual presence. This kind of unused content fascinates players and developers alike. It represents roads not taken, ideas that didn't quite work, features cut for time or balance or technical limitations. Every game contains these artifacts, remnants of earlier design phases that persist in code even when removed from actual gameplay. They're archaeological evidence of the development process, proof that games evolve significantly between concept and release. Tofu was a test character. The most famous secret character in Resident Evil 2 is Tofu, a giant block of tofu with a knife. Unlocking Tofu requires completing the game under specific conditions with both Leon and Claire, then playing through Hunk's scenario. Once unlocked, Tofu must escape the laboratory using only a knife and green herbs, making it one of the game's most difficult challenges. Tofu wasn't originally meant to be playable. The character existed as a test object for checking the game's collision detection and hit boxes. Developers needed a simple geometric shape to test how enemies interacted with player characters, and they used a tofu block because someone thought it was funny. The name came from this origin. It literally was a block of tofu used for testing purposes. As development progressed, the team grew fond of Tofu. The character became an inside joke, a symbol of the testing process. When considering secret unlockables, someone suggested making Tofu playable as a bonus for hardcore players. The idea was absurd enough to work. It rewarded skilled players with something deliberately ridiculous. Tofu appeared in Resident Evil 3's files, suggesting plans to include the character in that game as well. Tofu was cut at a late stage, leaving only code remnants. However, Tofu returns in the Resident Evil 2 remake, now with enhanced AI and even more challenging knife-only gameplay. The remake also added alternate Tofu characters with different appearances and loadouts, expanding the joke further. The Tofu concept exemplifies game development humor. Creating video games is difficult, stressful work involving long hours, tight deadlines, and enormous pressure. Inside jokes and absurd elements help maintain morale, giving developers something to laugh about during challenging production. Sometimes these jokes make it into finished games, becoming beloved by players who appreciate the human touch behind the product. Rebecca's basketball photo was extremely hidden. Resident Evil 2 contains one of gaming's most ridiculously hidden secrets. In the STARS office in the Raccoon City Police Department, players can find a special roll of film showing Rebecca Chambers wearing a basketball outfit. But finding this film requires clicking on Wesker's desk exactly 50 times. 50 times. There's no indication this is possible, no hint that repeated clicking will produce results, no feedback that progress is being made. Players must simply click the desk 50 times through pure dedication or insanity or both. The discovery of this secret required either incredible persistence or data mining the game's files to find the trigger condition. Once developed, the photo shows Rebecca, a basketball jersey and shorts, holding a ball, smiling at the camera. It's fan service, pure and simple, but hidden so thoroughly that most players would never see it without external knowledge. The difficulty of discovery became part of the secret's appeal. This was for dedicated fans willing to go beyond normal exploration. This reflects 1990s game design philosophy that has largely disappeared. Modern games make secrets discoverable with reasonable effort. Achievements guide players toward hidden content. Online communities share discoveries rapidly. But in 1998, secrets like this could remain genuinely secret, known only to those who stumbled upon them or read about them in strategy guides. The Rebecca photo became somewhat controversial in retrospect. Some players considered it objectifying, finding the hidden nature and pose inappropriate. Others defended it as harmless fan service from an era with different standards. Resident Evil 2's remake doesn't include the secret, though whether that's due to controversy or simply not replicating every obscure original element isn't clear. Wesker was supposed to be dead. Albert Wesker's survival past the first Resident Evil wasn't originally planned. In the original game, Wesker appears to die during the Tyrant encounter. The creature impales him and he collapses. That seemed conclusive. Players could find his body afterward, presumably deceased. The story suggested Wesker betrayed Stars for Umbrella, then died as a result of his own treachery. Simple, complete, done. Except Capcom liked the character. Wesker's cold charisma, his sunglasses, his betrayal arc made him compelling. Someone decided to bring him back, revealing he'd faked his death, using a prototype virus that granted superhuman abilities. This retcon transformed Wesker from a relatively minor villain into the franchise's primary antagonist for multiple games. The retcon works because Resident Evil's plot involves viruses that grant superpowers. making resurrection via secret injection narratively consistent. It also works because Wesker's actor, D.C. Douglas, brought menacing charm to the role. The character's exaggerated villainy, the Matrix-style dodging, the superhuman speed, the grandiose plans, made him fun to fight rather than just frustrating. Wesker's resurrection demonstrates how franchise storytelling adapts based on audience response and creative inspiration. Characters, initially designed as minor, can become central. Planned deaths can become fake outs. The narrative flexibility of serialized media allows course corrections based on what works, rather than rigid adherence to original plans. George Romero almost directed the first movie before Paul W.S. Anderson directed the live-action Resident Evil film. George Romero was attached to write and direct. This made perfect sense. Romero essentially created modern zombie cinema with Night of the Living Dead, and Resident Evil explicitly drew inspiration from his films. Getting Romero to direct the adaptation seemed like destiny. Romero wrote a screenplay that followed the first game relatively closely. It was set in the Spencer Mansion, featured STARS team members as protagonists, and maintained the game's claustrophobic atmosphere. However, Capcom and the production companies felt Romero's script was too faithful to the game, not cinematic enough, too niche for mainstream audiences. Romero was removed from the project. Paul W.S. Anderson took over, creating a very different approach that loosely borrowed Resident Evil elements while telling an original story focused on Alice, a character who doesn't exist in the games. Anderson's films became commercially successful despite divisive critical reception, grossing over $1.2 billion across 6 movies. What would Romero's Resident Evil have been like? Probably closer to actual survival horror, emphasizing atmosphere and dread over action set pieces. Possibly more socially conscious, given Romero's tendency to embed commentary about consumerism and social breakdown in his zombie films. Definitely different from what we got. Romero's removed screenplay exists in various drafts online, allowing fans to read what might have been. It's an interesting alternate history, the version of Resident Evil cinema that stayed true to source material rather than creating something new with borrowed aesthetics. The live-action films never explain the T-virus. Well, the Resident Evil film franchise, despite spanning 6 movies and over a decade, never provides a clear, consistent explanation of what the T-virus actually does or how it works. Each film adds new abilities or effects seemingly at random. Zombies gain different capabilities between movies. The rules change to serve plot convenience rather than internal consistency. In the first film, the T virus reanimates dead tissue, creating zombies. By the second film, it's causing mutations in living creatures. By the third, it's somehow granted Alice telekinetic powers. By the fourth, it's allowing mind control. The virus becomes a catch-all explanation for whatever supernatural ability the plot requires at that moment, functioning more like magic than a biological weapon. This contrasts sharply with the games, which maintain relatively consistent rules about viral effects. The T virus in games creates zombies and BOWs, bioorganic weapons, with specific characteristics. Different viruses produce different results. The science is obviously fictional, but it's applied consistently within its own logic. The film's approach suggests Anderson and producers weren't particularly concerned with biological plausibility or even internal consistency. They wanted action set pieces, apocalyptic scenarios, and spectacular violence. The T virus was simply a narrative tool rather than a subject of serious consideration. This worked commercially but frustrated fans who appreciated the game's attention to pseudo-scientific detail. The first game had blood messages that were cut. During early development of the original Resident Evil, the Spencer Mansion was meant to contain blood-written messages on walls. These messages would have provided environmental storytelling, showing the desperation and terror of previous victims. One message was supposed to read, "For God's sake, get out," a direct reference to Sweet Home, the game that inspired Resident Evil's creation. Almost all these messages were removed before release. Only one remnant survived in the final game, a blood stain on the wooden section of the main hall's back wall, visible when turning right to the second level at the top of the stairs. This stain is all that remains of a more elaborate environmental narrative system that would have used blood writing to guide and terrify players. The trial version of Resident Evil contained a bloody message near the West Wing staircase that didn't appear in the commercial release, proving these elements existed in playable builds before being cut. The removal likely came from concerns about excessive gore or worries that written messages would break immersion by making the horror too explicit rather than suggestive. The 2002 remake includes an Easter egg referencing this cut content. If players enter mole as a password in the remake's computer lab, the correct password from the original game, they'll hear Tofu speaking instead of unlocking the door. It's a small nod to series history, connecting the remake to both the original game and to cut content that never made it to players. Lisa Trevor wasn't in the original game. Lisa Trevor, one of Resident Evil's most tragic and disturbing characters, doesn't appear in the 1996 original. She was created specifically for the 2002 GameCube remake, adding a new layer of horror and pathos that the first game lacked. Her story, a young girl subjected to decades of experiments, driven insane while desperately holding on to memories of her parents, provided emotional weight the original narrative didn't have. Lisa's design emphasizes body horror. She wears a mask made from her mother's face, stitched over her own features, believing if she holds onto her mother's face, then her mother will return. Her body is covered with restraints and evidence of surgical procedures. She's nearly invincible during encounters, not because of combat prowess, but because she's survived so much trauma that normal damage barely registers. The character serves multiple narrative purposes. She explains aspects of the T-virus's development, showing Umbrella's willingness to experiment on children and maintain those experiments for decades. She provides a victim players can sympathize with, despite her monstrous appearance. She adds psychological horror to the biological horror that dominates the series. Lisa's madness is scarier than her mutations. Lisa became so integral to Resident Evil lore that subsequent games and media incorporated her into franchise mythology. She wasn't retconned as having been in the mansion all along. The remake openly presents her as new content, but her impact on storytelling demonstrated how remakes could enhance rather than simply recreate original experiences. Hunters were engineered from human embryos. The hunter enemies that appear partway through the first Resident Evil have disturbing origins that many players never learn. These creatures weren't created by infecting existing animals or humans with viruses. They were bioengineered from human embryos injected with reptile DNA and T-virus, then artificially gestated and trained as weapons. This makes hunters fundamentally different from zombies or other mutations. Zombies are people who got infected. Hunters were never people. They were designed as weapons from conception, grown specifically to kill, trained to be controllable. They represent Umbrella's ultimate goal, not accidental mutations from viral outbreaks, but deliberate creation of controllable bioorganic weapons for military applications. The implications are darker than simple infection horror. Umbrella is creating life specifically to be weapons, using human genetic material as the base, perverting reproduction into weapon manufacturing. The hunters' efficiency, their ability to decapitate players in a single attack, demonstrates that this approach works from Umbrella's perspective, which makes it more disturbing. Later games expanded on this concept. Resident Evil 5's lickers were revealed to be further mutations of zombies exposed to excessive T virus, but the principle of bioengineered weapons from embryos continued. The Tyrant series followed similar logic. These weren't infected people, but specifically created super soldiers grown in labs. The franchise's horror stems partly from realizing that intentional creation of monsters is worse than accidental creation. The Tyrant's exposed heart isn't a weakness. The iconic Tyrant boss that concludes the first Resident Evil has a distinctive design feature, an exposed heart visible on the outside of its torso. This naturally appears to be a weak point, a target for players to exploit. Conventional video game logic says glowing weak points should be attacked, but the Tyrant's exposed heart isn't actually a weakness in the traditional sense. That second heart serves a specific biological function. It's a secondary blood pump designed to support the Tyrant's massive musculature and accelerated metabolism during growth phases. It's exposed not because of poor design, but because the Tyrant encountered in-game is incomplete. The virus outbreak interrupted final bioengineering processes that would have armored or internalized the organ. More significantly, the Tyrant is completely sentient. Unlike hunters or zombies, the Tyrant retains full human intelligence. The person who became this Tyrant is aware, conscious, thinking. They simply lack free will, having been programmed through conditioning and control mechanisms to obey Umbrella's directives. This makes the Tyrant tragic rather than simply monstrous. Somewhere inside that weapon is a person who knows what they've become. The Tyrant program requires specific genetic markers. Not all humans can survive the transformation process. Only people with particular genetic profiles can become tyrants, making them rare and valuable. This rarity explains why Umbrella doesn't simply mass produce tyrants. They can't. They need to find suitable candidates, which limits scalability despite the tyrant's effectiveness as a weapon. Jill's sandwich line was unscripted. Perhaps the most memed line in Resident Evil history comes early in the first game. After Barry Burton saves Jill Valentine from a trap, he says, "You were almost a Jill sandwich." The line's awkwardness became instantly iconic, representing the game's charming voice, acting failures. Players quote it decades later, recognizing it immediately. The line wasn't in the original script. Barry's voice actor, Barry Gerda, improvised it during recording. The script called for Barry to express relief that Jill survived, but the exact phrasing was left to the actor. Gerda decided Barry would use a weird metaphor to cut tension with inappropriate humor, and Jill's sandwich emerged from that choice. The director kept it. They could have done another take, could have requested something more conventional, but someone decided the weird phrasing fit Barry's character and the game's B-movie aesthetic. That decision transformed a throwaway line into gaming history. Jill's sandwich became shorthand for Resident Evil's campy charm, proof that the game doesn't take itself entirely seriously. The remake replaced the line, giving Barry more naturalistic dialogue. Some fans were disappointed, missing the campy original, while others appreciated the more serious tone. The debate reflects larger questions about whether remakes should preserve charming failures or aim for polish that removes personality. There's no correct answer. It depends on what each player values in the experience. Claire was created to replace. Elsa Claire Redfield didn't exist in Resident Evil 1.5, the scrapped version of Resident Evil 2. That prototype featured a different female protagonist named Elsa Walker, a college student and motorcycle racer who happened to be in Raccoon City when the outbreak occurred. Elsa had no connection to existing characters. She was simply an ordinary person caught in extraordinary circumstances. When development restarted, the team decided to create stronger narrative connections to the first game. Claire was designed as Chris Redfield's younger sister, searching for her brother after he went missing following the Spencer Mansion incident. This gave her personal stakes in the story beyond mere survival. Her search for Chris connected both games narratively, while allowing Claire to stand as her own character rather than simply being Chris's sister. Claire's design incorporated elements from Elsa. The motorcycle aesthetic survived. Claire arrives in Raccoon City on a bike, wears a jacket with motorcycle styling. The core concept of a civilian protagonist rather than military personnel also carried over. But Claire's personality, motivation, and role in the larger story were completely new, created specifically for the revised Resident Evil 2. The change proved successful. Claire became one of the franchise's most popular characters, starring in Code Veronica and appearing in multiple other games and films. Her relationship with Chris provided emotional grounding for both characters. The decision to scrap Elsa and create Claire demonstrates how mid-development changes can significantly improve final products when executed well. Leon was supposed to succumb to infection. During Resident Evil 4's chaotic development, one version featured Leon gradually losing control to the progenitor virus. The game would track his infection level throughout, with Leon experiencing hallucinations, loss of motor control, and eventual transformation. Players would watch the protagonist slowly become the thing he was fighting, adding tragic inevitability to the horror. This concept was dark even by Resident Evil standards, making the player complicit in Leon's deterioration, forcing them to continue playing as he lost humanity. Would have been psychologically brutal. Resident Evil games typically allow escape and triumph. This version would have ended in failure regardless of player skill, with Leon's transformation predetermined. The idea was abandoned because it removed player agency. As Leon's condition worsened, gameplay would become more difficult through degraded controls and impaired abilities. This felt punishing rather than scary, frustrating rather than tragic. Players want to struggle against odds, not watch predetermined doom unfold. The concept worked thematically but failed mechanically. Elements survived into the final game. Leon does get infected with Las Plagas, requiring periodic treatments to suppress the parasite. Ada provides medication that prevents full transformation, but this version keeps the player in control, adds urgency through time pressure without removing agency. The infection becomes a manageable threat rather than inevitable doom, maintaining tension without creating frustration. Ada Wong's original voice actress was replaced. For Resident Evil 2's remake in 2019, Ada Wong was voiced by Jolene Anderson, who brought sultry professionalism to the character. However, when Resident Evil 4's remake arrived in 2023, Ada's voice changed to Lily Gao, who had previously portrayed Ada in the live-action Welcome to Raccoon City film. The recasting proved controversial. Some fans felt Gao's performance lacked the polish and character that Anderson brought. Others defended Gao, noting that she was working with different direction and a different interpretation of Ada's character. The debate highlighted how voice actors become associated with characters, how changes in performance can feel jarring even when new actors are technically competent. Voice acting in games exists in precarious position. Unlike film, where actors' faces are synonymous with characters, game voice actors provide only sound. They can be replaced between entries with minimal explanation. This creates instability. Players develop attachments to performances, but those performances aren't guaranteed to continue. The person who defines a character through multiple games might suddenly be replaced, sometimes for budgetary reasons, sometimes for creative direction, sometimes without clear explanation. The Ada situation reflects broader issues with the voice actor treatment in gaming. Actors frequently aren't told when they're auditioning for established franchises. They may record performances without knowing context. They can be replaced without warning or explanation. The disconnect between the importance of voice performances and the precarious nature of voice actor employment creates situations where beloved performances disappear, replaced by new actors facing inevitable comparison. The Regeneradors required infrared scope to kill. Resident Evil 4 introduced the Regeneradors, nightmare creatures that could restore themselves from nearly any damage. Shooting them appeared futile. They'd collapse, then stand back up moments later, fully healed. Standard combat strategies failed. Players who tried conventional approaches wasted ammunition and time, discovering these enemies couldn't be permanently killed through normal means. The solution required specific equipment and knowledge. Regeneradors contained multiple Las Plagas parasites throughout their bodies. The infrared scope allowed players to see these parasites, marked as glowing spots. Only by destroying every parasite in a Regenerador's body could players permanently kill it. This turned combat into a puzzle. Scan for parasites, carefully aim at each location, ensure all are destroyed before moving on. The design was brilliant. It forced players to engage tactically rather than rely on reflexes and firepower. It rewarded observation and precision over aggression. The Regeneradors created genuine tension through their design alone. Their blank faces, their unsettling breathing sounds, their spiky variants that released spines when approached. They were scary not through jump scares, but through their fundamental wrongness. The Resident Evil 4 remake kept Regeneradors largely unchanged, recognizing their near perfect design. The remake added slight variations and enhanced their audio design, making their breathing even more disturbing, but the core concept, unkillable enemies that require special equipment and tactical thinking, remained intact because it worked so effectively the first time. The giant alligator could be killed. Early Resident Evil 2 features a memorable boss encounter with a giant alligator in the sewers. The standard approach involves running from the creature down a corridor, hitting a switch to drop a gas canister, then shooting the canister as the alligator approaches, causing an explosion that kills it. This creates a tense chase sequence where players must time their actions perfectly. However, players discovered an alternative. Before triggering the boss encounter, they could shoot into the water where the alligator waits. After several shots, the alligator would emerge and swallow Leon or Claire whole, causing an instant death. This secret death animation became something players sought out, proof of the game's attention to detail in accounting for player experimentation. The remake preserved this secret, updating the animation with modern graphics. Players can still shoot the water before the chase sequence and receive the same instant death punishment. It's completely optional, provides no benefit, and most players would never discover it without external knowledge. But its inclusion demonstrates Capcom's commitment to faithfully recreating even obscure details from the original. These kinds of secrets reward exploration and experimentation. They suggest the game world has depth beyond prescribed interactions, that actions have consequences even when those consequences are immediately fatal. The alligator death is memorable precisely because it's unnecessary, hidden, and specific. A developer's anticipating unusual player behavior and creating content for it. Hunk's scenario was extremely difficult as an Evil 2 rewards players who complete both Leon and Claire scenarios under specific conditions by unlocking Hunk's escape scenario called The Fourth Survivor. Hunk is an Umbrella mercenary tasked with retrieving a G virus sample from the Raccoon City outbreak. His scenario begins at the bottom of the laboratory, requiring players to fight their way back to the surface with limited resources. The difficulty is brutal. Hunk starts with specific equipment: a combat knife, a handgun, some ammunition, and limited healing items. The path to escape is filled with some of the game's toughest enemies, including multiple lickers and ivy creatures. Resources are intentionally insufficient for fighting everything, forcing players to decide when to fight and when to run. This scenario exists as pure challenge. There's minimal story, no cutscenes, no exploration, just survival from point A to point B against overwhelming odds. Completing it marks mastery of the game's combat and resource management systems. Players must know enemy positions, movement patterns, optimal paths. It's a victory lap that's harder than anything in the main campaign. The remake expanded Hunk's scenario slightly, adding more detail to his character and mission, but the core challenge remained: an intentionally difficult gauntlet designed to test skilled players. Hunk became a cult favorite character despite minimal screen time, his stoic professionalism and mysterious background making him intriguing, despite appearing in glorified bonus content. Revelations was originally using traditional zombies, Resident Evil, Revelations, developed for Nintendo 3DS and later ported to other platforms, takes place primarily on a cruise ship called the Queen Zenobius. The game features enemies called ooze, mutated creatures created by the T-Abyss virus that thrives in aquatic environments. These enemies have distinctive appearances with visible water damage, giving them a drowned, waterlogged aesthetic that fits the nautical setting. Originally, Revelations was planned to use standard T-virus zombies. Early development had traditional shambling undead populating the ship. However, when the decision was made to emphasize the aquatic setting, developers realized standard zombies didn't fit thematically. Water and zombies don't have obvious connections beyond vague ideas about bloating and decomposition. The T-Abyss virus was created specifically to justify aquatic mutations. This gave enemies water-based biology, with some appearing almost mermaid-like in their movement patterns. The ooze could move fluidly, emerge from water, and generally feel connected to their environment in ways standard zombies couldn't. The change strengthened the game's identity, making Revelations distinct from other entries rather than simply Resident Evil on a boat. Interestingly, files from Resident Evil 5 remain hidden in Revelations code. Bosses and enemies from that game exist as unused assets. This suggests Revelations was built using RE5's engine and initially borrowed more directly from that game before developing its own identity through the T-Abyss concept and aquatic themes. The merchant's identity was never explained. Resident Evil 4's mysterious merchant, who appears throughout Leon's mission selling weapons and upgrades, is never explained. Where does he get his inventory? How does he travel to remote locations before Leon arrives? Why is he helping someone fighting Los Illuminados? The game provides zero answers, treating the merchant as a gameplay abstraction that doesn't require justification. This approach works because Resident Evil 4 embraces pulp adventure more than strict realism. The merchant exists because the game needs a shop system, and rather than trying to justify it narratively, the developers simply made him mysterious and memorable. His purple cloak, his raspy voice, his catchphrases all contribute to making a functional gameplay element entertaining rather than just utilitarian. The remake maintains this approach, keeping the merchant unexplained. The decision to preserve mystery suggests developers recognize that some things work better without explanation. Trying to justify how the merchant operates would require convoluted backstory that adds nothing while potentially breaking the spell of his mysteriousness. Resident Evil Village's Duke serves the same function while being equally unexplained. The Duke's reference to Resident Evil 4's merchant, calling his catchphrase something an old friend used to say, suggests connection between them without explaining what that connection is. Are they the same being? Members of the same organization? Supernatural entities that exist across time? The games don't care, and that's fine. Separate Ways was significant DLC Resident Evil 4's Separate Ways expansion, which lets players experience the game's events from Ada Wong's perspective, was originally GameCube exclusive content included in later versions. The mode reveals what Ada was doing during moments she wasn't visible in Leon's campaign, showing her secret missions for Wesker, her complicated relationship with Leon, and her role in the larger conspiracy. The content is substantial, roughly 5 hours of gameplay with unique scenarios, boss fights, and story revelations. It's not merely a side mode, but an essential piece of the narrative that recontextualizes Leon's entire journey. Events that seemed straightforward in Leon's campaign gain new dimension when viewed through Ada's perspective, revealing layers of manipulation and hidden agendas. When Resident Evil 4 received its remake in 2023, Separate Ways wasn't included at launch. This disappointed fans who considered it essential rather than optional. Capcom later released Separate Ways as downloadable content, fully remaking Ada's campaign with the same care as the main game. The expansion received praise for enhancing Ada's characterization and providing more time with one of the series' most enigmatic characters. Separate Ways demonstrates how substantial DLC can enhance games rather than feeling like cut content sold separately. The expansion adds meaningful story content that enriches the base game without being necessary to understand Leon's campaign. Players who never play Separate Ways miss nuance and background but don't miss essential plot. It's supplementary in the best sense, adding depth without creating dependency. Outbreak was ambitious multiplayer Resident Evil Outbreak, and its sequel, Outbreak File Number 2, released for PlayStation 2, represented Capcom's attempt at online cooperative survival horror. The games featured multiple scenarios set during the Raccoon City outbreak, with players choosing from various civilian characters, each with unique abilities, to survive and escape together. The concept was ahead of its time. Online console gaming in 2003-2004 was primitive compared to modern standards. PlayStation 2's network adapter was optional, meaning most players couldn't experience the games as intended. Communication was limited. No voice chat, only preset text phrases. Technical limitations made the experience frustrating rather than revolutionary. Outbreak was originally called Resident Evil Online and planned to be much larger. More scenarios, more characters, more locations, all cut to meet technical and budgetary constraints. A third game was planned but never materialized, leaving plot threads unresolved and potential unrealized. The games deserve recognition for ambition despite execution problems. They attempted cooperative survival horror nearly a decade before Left 4 Dead made that concept mainstream. They created ordinary characters rather than special forces operatives, making vulnerability central to gameplay. They integrated light RPG elements, allowing character customization and specialization. Modern ports or remakes could potentially realize Outbreak's vision properly. With contemporary online infrastructure, voice chat, and technical capabilities, the core concept could work as originally intended. The games remain cult favorites among series fans, representing a fascinating what if about Resident Evil's unexplored potential. Devil May Cry started as Resident Evil 4. This fact appears earlier but deserves expansion. The version of Resident Evil 4 that became Devil May Cry wasn't just conceptually similar, it was literally Resident Evil 4 in development. Hideki Kamiya was directing what was officially called Resident Evil 4, set in a castle, featuring Leon Kennedy as protagonist. The game emphasized stylish combat, acrobatic movement, and over the top action. Leon had superhuman abilities, performed elaborate combos, and fought enemies that were more supernatural than biological. Capcom executives looked at what Kamiya had created and realized it was no longer Resident Evil. The horror was gone, replaced by action-heavy, stylish combat that played nothing like previous entries. Rather than force Kamiya to rework everything into something more Resident Evil-like, Capcom made a creative decision. They let Kamiya continue developing his game, but removed it from Resident Evil brand. The project became Devil May Cry, with Leon replaced by Dante, the castle becoming more explicitly gothic fantasy, and the entire aesthetic embracing punk rock attitude rather than survival horror atmosphere. This was good for both franchises. Devil May Cry became a phenomenon, defining a new genre of stylish action games and spawning multiple sequels. Resident Evil 4 eventually found its identity in a different direction, creating the over the shoulder action horror hybrid that influenced countless games afterward. The split allowed both concepts to flourish rather than compromising one for the other. The story demonstrates enlightened franchise management. Capcom could have insisted Kamiya stay within Resident Evil conventions, resulting in a compromised product that satisfied neither horror fans nor action fans. Instead, they recognized value in what was being created and gave it space to exist as something new. That flexibility benefits everyone. Players got two great franchises instead of one disappointing one. Haunting Ground also came from RE4 development, the castle version of Resident Evil 4, the one featuring Leon fighting hookmen in gothic environments, also became a separate game. This iteration went further into development than the Devil May Cry version, with substantial work done on environments, enemy design, and atmosphere. When it was deemed too far from Resident Evil's identity, Capcom, again, chose to spin it off rather than waste the work. Haunting Ground released for PlayStation 2 in 2005, the same year as the final Resident Evil 4. It stars Fiona, a young woman who awakens in a castle with amnesia, accompanied by a dog named Huey. The game emphasizes flight over fight. Fiona has no weapons, relying on stealth, puzzle solving, and Huey's assistance to survive against enemies including crazed alchemists and homunculi. The castle environments directly descended from RE4's castle build, repurposed and enhanced. The emphasis on pursuit enemies, the gothic atmosphere, the mixing of puzzles and horror, all elements that didn't fit Resident Evil 4's final direction but worked for a different kind of survival horror experience. Haunting Ground received mixed reviews but developed a cult following. Its emphasis on vulnerability and lack of combat created unique tension. Fiona's dependence on Huey made the dog companion feel genuinely important rather than merely decorative. The game explored ideas about bodies, reproduction, and identity that were more mature and disturbing than typical horror game content. Between Devil May Cry and Haunting Ground, Resident Evil 4's troubled development spawned two additional franchises. This is extraordinary productivity from what could have been a development disaster. Rather than viewing failed iterations as waste, Capcom recognized salvageable elements and gave them new life. This recycling of concepts and assets across projects is practical, but also creates interesting, creative cross-pollination. Onimusha also has RE4 DNA, the samurai ninja themed version of Resident Evil 4, where zombies appeared from trapdoors and fake walls, also didn't go to waste. Elements from this iteration were recycled into the Onimusha series, particularly influencing Onimusha's approach to enemy encounters and level design. Onimusha wasn't created from Resident Evil 4 as directly as Devil May Cry or Haunting Ground, but the cross-pollination is documented. The series already existed before RE4's development, but ideas from RE4's various iterations influenced Onimusha's evolution. The mixing of historical settings with supernatural threats, the emphasis on melee combat, the puzzle solving in exotic locations, all benefited from concepts Resident Evil 4 explored and abandoned. This creates a fascinating development ecosystem within Capcom. Multiple teams working on different projects would share ideas, assets, and concepts. Something that didn't work for Resident Evil might work for Devil May Cry. Something that didn't fit Devil May Cry might enhance Onimusha. This collaborative environment prevented good ideas from dying just because they didn't fit one specific project. The RE4 situation was extreme. Multiple complete games emerged from its development cycle, but the principle of recycling and sharing across projects is standard industry practice. The difference is most companies don't publicly acknowledge these connections. While Capcom's various interviews and development materials have made RE4's chaotic creation well documented, there was a Resident Evil Gaiden released for Game Boy Color in 2001, is one of the series' strangest entries. Developed by M4 Limited rather than Capcom proper, it features Barry Burton investigating a cruise ship where bioweapons have run amok. Leon Kennedy appears as a supporting character who may or may not be infected and replaced by a BOW. The game uses an overhead perspective for exploration, but switches to a first-person shooting gallery for combat. A cursor bounces left and right across the screen, with players timing button presses to hit enemies. This makes combat tedious and disconnected from exploration, creating a disjointed experience. Canonically, Gaiden exists in uncertain space. Capcom has neither explicitly confirmed nor denied its place in series continuity. The game's plot about Leon potentially being replaced doesn't fit with his appearances in other games. The story feels isolated, disconnected from broader franchise narrative. Most fans and official materials treat it as non-canon, essentially an authorized side story that doesn't impact the main narrative. Gaiden represents the risks of licensing franchises to external developers for handheld ports. The Game Boy Color couldn't support Resident Evil gameplay properly, requiring radical changes that compromise the experience. The result is technically impressive for the hardware, but fundamentally unsatisfying as a Resident Evil game. It's a curiosity, notable primarily for existing rather than for quality. Dead Aim was a light gun game, Resident Evil. Dead Aim released for PlayStation 2 in 2003, attempted to create a Resident Evil experience using light gun peripheral. The game features a unique control scheme where exploration uses standard controls, but combat switches to first person aiming with the GunCon light gun. The split between exploration and combat created awkwardness. Switching between control schemes interrupted flow, making transitions feel disjointed. The light gun combat was fine as arcade style shooting, but clashed with Resident Evil's emphasis on atmosphere and resource management. The game exists in the uncomfortable space between two genres without excelling at either. Dead Aim's story involves investigating a cruise ship, a setting the franchise has revisited multiple times, where Umbrella has conducted experiments. Bruce McGivern and Fong Ling serve as protagonists, characters who never appeared in other games and had minimal impact on franchise lore. The plot is serviceable but forgettable, existing mainly to justify shooting mutated creatures on a boat. The game is primarily notable for demonstrating what doesn't work for Resident Evil. Light gun mechanics remove the deliberate aiming and resource anxiety that makes the series tense. Making shooting too easy undermines survival horror's core tension. Dead Aim isn't terrible, but it's not particularly good, and it contributed nothing significant to the franchise beyond existing as an experimental side entry. Survivor was even worse. Resident Evil Survivor, released for PlayStation in 2000, holds the distinction of being one of the worst received entries in the entire franchise. It's a first person rail shooter where players walk through environments shooting enemies with minimal strategy or exploration. The game was designed for light gun use, but technical issues meant the light gun often didn't work properly, forcing players to use standard controls. The story follows Ark Thompson investigating Sheena Island, where Umbrella has been conducting experiments. Ark has amnesia, slowly recovering memories throughout the game. The narrative is paper thin, existing primarily to move players between shooting galleries. Multiple endings exist based on player choices, but none are particularly satisfying or memorable. Survivor's critical reception was brutal. Reviews criticized the terrible graphics, awkward controls, minimal horror elements, and complete lack of tension. The game felt like a cheap cash in on the Resident Evil name rather than a sincere attempt to explore new gameplay directions. It's the kind of game that damages franchise reputation, making players wary of side entries and experimental formats. Despite negative reception, Survivor received sequels. Survivor 2, Code Veronica, and Dead Aim both exist in the Light Gun sub-series. This suggests Capcom saw value in the format despite critical failure, possibly due to Japanese arcade success where light gun games remained more popular than in Western markets. The Resident Evil 5 demo was specially designed. Before Resident Evil 5's release in March 2009, Capcom released a demo featuring a segment from the game's opening village sequence. This wasn't simply an extracted section from the full game. It was specifically designed and balanced as a standalone demo experience with different enemy patterns, pacing, and objectives than what appeared in the final product. The demo showcased the game's co-op mechanics, with AI partner Sheva accompanying Chris through the village assault. It demonstrated the over-the-shoulder shooting, the emphasis on action, and the African setting that marked the game's identity. Player response was largely positive, building anticipation for the full release. However, the demo sparked controversy about racial representation. The game's African setting meant most enemies were African villagers infected with Las Plagas. Critics argued this recreated colonialist imagery of white protagonists shooting African natives. Capcom defended the creative choices, noting previous games set in Spain and Eastern Europe featured European enemies without similar complaints, but the controversy persisted. The demo's role in shaping public perception demonstrates the importance of these pre-release experiences. First impressions established through demos can define how players approach full games. In this case, the demo succeeded mechanically, but created narrative concerns that colored the full game's reception. Managing both gameplay demonstration and thematic communication through limited demo content is challenging, and Resident Evil 5's demo shows how one aspect can succeed while another creates problems. Resident Evil 6 had 4 separate campaigns. Resident Evil 6's structure was unprecedented for the franchise. Rather than a single campaign or 2 character paths through the same events, the game featured 4 completely separate campaigns with different protagonists, locations, tones, and gameplay styles. Leon's campaign was survival horror in the United States and China. Chris's campaign was military shooter in China. Jake and Sherry's campaign mixed chase sequences with action across multiple countries. Ada's campaign focused on solo stealth and puzzle solving. Each campaign lasted roughly 5-6 hours, making the complete game over 20 hours long. This would seem to provide extraordinary value, but the length actually hurt the game. The campaigns shared similar gameplay mechanics despite attempting different tones, creating repetition. Enemy encounters became tedious through overexposure. The game felt padded, stretched beyond its idea's capacity to remain interesting. The interconnected narratives created confusion rather than depth. Events from one campaign would be referenced in another, but the chronology was unclear without external guides. The game expected players to complete all 4 campaigns to understand the full story, but the investment required made this exhausting rather than rewarding. The approach demonstrated Capcom trying to satisfy every player type simultaneously. Horror fans got Leon's campaign, action fans got Chris's campaign, chase sequence fans got Jake's campaign, solo players got Ada's campaign, but fragmenting the experience prevented any campaign from fully developing its identity. Each felt like a compromise, diluted by the need to fit into a larger framework. The Executioner was originally much larger. Resident Evil 5's Executioner, Majini, the massive enemy wielding a giant axe who appears in the game's opening village sequence, was originally designed to be even larger and more intimidating. Early concept art shows the Executioner at truly gigantic proportions, nearly twice the height implemented in the final game. The size was reduced for practical gameplay reasons. An enemy that large created camera problems in enclosed spaces. Players couldn't effectively track its movements or attacks. The collision detection became problematic. Making the Executioner slightly smaller allowed it to function as an intimidating mini-boss without creating technical issues. Even at reduced size, the Executioner remains memorable. Its design evokes both traditional Executioner imagery and horror iconography like Pyramid Head from Silent Hill 2. The massive axe, the hooded appearance, the slow, inevitable approach all contribute to creating a threatening presence that requires different tactics than standard enemies. The Executioner appears multiple times throughout Resident Evil 5, becoming a recurring challenge rather than a one-time encounter. This repetition somewhat diminishes its impact. The first appearance is terrifying, but subsequent encounters become routine. This demonstrates the difficulty of balancing memorable enemy design with practical implementation across a full game. Shiva was motion captured by a professional. Shiva Alomar, Chris's partner throughout Resident Evil 5, was performed by Michelle van der Water for motion capture, and Karen Dyer for voice acting. Vanderwater is a professional stunt performer and martial artist, which shows in Sheva's physical movements and combat animations. The decision to use a stunt performer for motion capture elevated Sheva's physicality beyond typical video game animation. Her movements feel natural and grounded, with weight and momentum that comes from someone who actually knows how bodies move in combat situations. This attention to physical performance makes Shiva feel more real and capable than if animations had been created purely through animation software. This approach became standard for Resident Evil and many other AID games. Using professional performers, stunt actors, martial artists, dancers for motion capture provides authenticity that animators alone can't replicate. Real human movement contains subtle elements that are difficult to artificially create: weight shifts, momentum transfer, the way muscles engage and disengage. Capturing real performance preserves these details. The split between physical performance and voice acting is common, but creates interesting questions. Sheva's physicality comes from one person, while her voice and dialogue come from another. The character is a composite, assembled from multiple performers' contributions. This is standard practice, but it means the actor who plays a video game character is actually multiple people collaborating to create a unified performance. Revelations featured raid mode. Resident Evil Revelations introduced raid mode, an arcade-style mode separate from the main campaign, where players fight through modified campaign levels with score attacks, time limits, and special modifiers. Players can choose from multiple characters, upgrade weapons extensively, and compete for high scores. Raid mode proved surprisingly popular, many players spending more time with it than the campaign. The mode provided immediate, action-focused gameplay without narrative concerns. It was perfect for short play sessions, offering clear objectives and measurable progression. The weapon upgrade system was deeper than the campaign's, allowing for extensive customization and experimentation. The success prompted Capcom to include similar modes in subsequent games. Revelations 2 expanded raid mode significantly. Other entries introduced variants like the Mercenaries mode. These arcade-style editions recognize that not all players want narrative experiences. Some simply want refined action gameplay with progression systems. Raid mode represents how games can serve multiple audiences within a single package. The campaign provides traditional Resident Evil survival horror experience. Raid mode provides action-focused score attack gameplay. Players who only want one or the other can ignore the rest, while players who enjoy both get exceptional value. This kind of content variety has become standard in modern AAA games, providing something for everyone rather than committing fully to a single vision. Revelations 2 featured episodic release. Resident Evil Revelations 2 attempted an unusual release structure for the franchise: episodic distribution. The game released in 4 weekly episodes starting February 2015, with each episode containing a chunk of story featuring both Barry Burton and Claire Redfield as protagonists across different timelines. The episodic structure theoretically created anticipation between releases, building community discussion as players speculated about upcoming developments. However, in practice, many players waited for the complete release before purchasing, preferring to play the full story without interruption. The episodic model worked better for Telltale's choice-driven adventure games than for Resident Evil's action horror format. Each episode featured 2 campaigns. Claire's campaign took place during the island outbreak, while Barry's campaign occurred 6 months later as he searched for Claire. This dual timeline structure created mystery about what happened between campaigns, but the week-long gaps between episodes meant players had to remember previous events rather than experiencing the story as a continuous flow. The complete edition released physically once all episodes were available, providing the traditional purchase option for players who disliked episodic format. This became the definitive way to experience the game, rendering the episodic experiment interesting, but ultimately not particularly impactful. Capcom hasn't attempted episodic release for Resident Evil since, suggesting they recognized the format didn't suit the franchise. RE7 demo featured mysterious mannequin family. The Resident Evil 7 demo, titled Beginning Hour, featured a strange detail that sparked enormous speculation. In one section, players could discover a room containing a family of mannequins arranged around a dinner table. The mannequins seemed to move when players weren't looking at them directly, or at least appeared in different positions when players returned to the room. This detail drove players to obsessive investigation. Was there a pattern to the mannequins' movement? Did they represent the Baker family? Were they hints about the game's story? Entire YouTube analysis videos dissected every frame, looking for clues or patterns. The community went slightly mad trying to solve the mannequin mystery. The truth was disappointing. The mannequins were just creepy environmental decoration. There was no pattern, no puzzle, no deeper meaning. Capcom had created unsettling atmosphere that players overinterpreted, finding significance where none existed. The mannequins worked perfectly as horror elements. Their ambiguous wrongness was scarier than any explained threat. The incident demonstrates how demos and teasers can generate engagement through mystery. Players will obsess over details, finding meanings that developers never intended. The beginning hour demo succeeded partly because it gave players something to analyze and debate, creating community engagement through speculation rather than clear answers. The Baker family was sympathetic. Resident Evil 7's antagonists, Jack, Marguerite, and Lucas Baker, are initially presented as monstrous villains who torture and murder visitors to their Louisiana farmhouse. However, the game gradually reveals they were once normal people infected by Eveline, a bioweapon designed to create controllable families through mind control. Jack and Marguerite are victims, not villains. They're fighting against Eveline's influence throughout the game, occasionally breaking through to their real selves. Jack's appearances swing between homicidal violence and moments of clarity where he recognizes what's happening and begs Ethan to stop him. Marguerite seems lost deeper in infection but shows maternal instincts toward Eveline that suggest her original personality influencing corrupted behavior. Lucas is more complicated. He was infected but somehow broke free from Eveline's direct control while maintaining his connection to the mold. He chooses to work with the Connections, the organization that created Eveline, using his family's tragedy for his own purposes. Lucas is genuinely villainous, while Jack and Marguerite are tragic. This moral complexity adds depth rarely seen in Resident Evil antagonists. Most games feature straightforward villains motivated by power, profit, or madness. The Bakers are innocent people corrupted by forces beyond their control. Killing them becomes sad rather than triumphant. Ethan isn't saving the day. He's ending the suffering of people who were victims before they became monsters. Ethan's face is always hidden throughout both Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil Village. Ethan Winter's face is never clearly shown. The first-person perspective naturally obscures the protagonist's face during gameplay, but even cutscenes carefully avoid showing Ethan directly. When cameras might show his face, something blocks the view: shadows, camera angles, objects in the way. This careful avoidance can't be accidental. The reasoning becomes clear with the revelation that Ethan died and was reanimated by mold. Hiding his face reinforces that something is wrong with him, that he's not quite human anymore. The obscurement creates subtle wrongness that players might not consciously notice but which affects the experience. It also maintains Ethan as player surrogate. Without a clear face, players can more easily project themselves onto him. The technique isn't new. Many first person games avoid showing the protagonist's face to maintain immersion. But Resident Evil 7 and Village take this further, deliberately hiding Ethan's face even in third person camera moments where it would naturally be visible. The extra effort to maintain this concealment suggests narrative purpose rather than mere convention. The decision proved divisive. Some players appreciated Ethan's mysterious quality. Others found the deliberate obscurement distracting, breaking immersion by drawing attention to what was being hidden. There's no perfect answer. Showing his face would remove mystery, while hiding it creates different problems. Capcom chose mystery, accepting the trade offs. Chris's face changed significantly. Chris Redfield has appeared in multiple Resident Evil games spanning decades, and his appearance has changed significantly between entries. This isn't simply improved graphics. In some games, Chris looks like a completely different person. Resident Evil 7's Chris is particularly controversial, looking nothing like his appearance in previous games. The change confused players. Some wondered if this was intentionally a different character masquerading as Chris, part of the game's mystery. The truth was simpler: different face models and artistic direction between games. Capcom didn't maintain consistent appearance across entries, treating Chris's look as flexible based on each game's needs. This creates a strange situation where Chris Redfield is simultaneously one of the franchise's most consistent characters, appearing in more games than almost anyone, and also one of its least visually consistent. The character's identity comes from voice, personality, and role rather than specific physical appearance. In a medium where character appearance is carefully controlled, this fluidity is unusual. The situation reflects practical realities of long running game franchises. Art styles change, graphics, technology evolves, different developers and artists work on different entries. Maintaining perfect visual consistency across decades of development is difficult. Some franchises manage it through careful documentation and reference materials. Resident Evil apparently decided consistency wasn't essential, allowing each game to reimagine characters visually. Village's development started from RE7 DLC plans. Resident Evil Village began life as planned downloadable content for Resident Evil 7. Capcom intended to create a substantial expansion, continuing Ethan's story, exploring what happened after the Baker House incident. As development progressed, the scope expanded beyond what made sense for DLC, eventually becoming a full sequel. This explains Village's strong connections to RE7. Both feature Ethan as protagonist. Both use first-person perspective. Both involve mysterious organizations manipulating bioweapons. Village essentially continues RE7's story, making it more direct sequel than most numbered Resident Evil entries are to their predecessors. The expansion from DLC to full game allowed more ambitious ideas. The village setting, multiple lords to fight, the fairy tale atmosphere, all beyond DLC scope. The decision to make it Resident Evil 8 rather than Resident Evil 7 to 2 or a subtitled expansion gave it marketing weight as a numbered entry, suggesting significance beyond mere expansion. This development path is increasingly common. Many modern games release substantial DLC that could have been sequels, While some DLC projects expand into full games, the line between expansion and sequel blurs when DLC can provide 10 plus hours of content. Village represents the sequel end of this spectrum, too large to be DLC, too connected to be fully independent. The Four Lords reference horror archetypes. Resident Evil Village's four lords, Lady Dimitrescu, Donna Beneviento, Salvatore Moreau, and Carl Heisenberg, represent classic horror monster archetypes. Dimitrescu is a vampire, Beneviento is a witch, Shash dollmaker, Moreau is a fishman monster from the Black Lagoon tradition, and Heisenberg is a steampunk's mad scientist. This wasn't subtle. The game openly embraced these horror traditions, mixing them with Resident Evil's biological horror foundations. Each lord's domain reflected their archetype: Dimitrescu's castle, Beneviento's haunted house, Moreau's reservoir, Heisenberg's factory. The game became a tour of horror subgenres, each section providing a different flavor of fear. The fairy tale aesthetics reinforced this approach. Village feels like a dark fairy tale where traditional monsters exist, but with scientific explanations. The Kadu parasite, created from mold-infected nematodes, causes mutations that happen to resemble vampires, werewolves, and other legendary creatures. This lets the game have fun with horror archetypes, while maintaining series' biological horror foundations. The varied approach created gameplay variety. Each lord's domain played differently. Dimitrescu's castle was exploration and pursuit. Beneviento's house was puzzle and psychological horror. Moreau's reservoir was traditional action. Heisenberg's factory was combat gauntlet. This prevented monotony across the game's length, ensuring each section felt distinct despite sharing core mechanics. Miranda was the series' origin mother. Miranda, Resident Evil Village's true antagonist, is revealed to be the origin point for the entire franchise. The Spencer Mansion, Umbrella Corporation, the progenitor virus, all trace back to Oswell Spencer encountering Miranda decades earlier. She inspired his research, inadvertently creating the organization that would cause all of Resident Evil's outbreaks and tragedies. This retcon recontextualizes the entire series. Everything that happened, Raccoon City's destruction, countless deaths, global bioterrorism, stems from one woman's grief-driven attempt to resurrect her dead daughter. Miranda's experiments with the mold inspired Spencer's viral research, setting him on the path that created Umbrella and the T-virus. The revelation risks feeling like a cheap retcon that diminishes Spencer's villainy. However, it works because Miranda isn't presented as the true villain orchestrating everything. She's simply the inspiration, the starting point. Spencer took her ideas and ran with them in directions she never intended. She's responsible for inspiring evil, not creating it directly. Miranda's character adds tragic dimension to Resident Evil's history. The entire franchise's horrors stem from maternal grief, from a woman who couldn't accept her daughter's death. Her pursuit of resurrection through bioweapons mirrors Ethan's desperate attempts to save his family. They're parallel characters separated by morality. Ethan won't sacrifice others to save his family, while Miranda will sacrifice anyone. Rose was a bioweapon, Rose Winters. Ethan and Mia's daughter is essentially a bioweapon. She was conceived after both parents had been infected with mold. Ethan was already dead and reanimated. Mia was infected during the Baker incident. Rose inherited properties of the mold, making her powerful enough that multiple factions wanted to capture or kill her. The game treats Rose as innocent despite her nature. She didn't choose to be born as a mold hybrid. Her parents didn't intentionally create a bioweapon. She's simply a child whose biology happens to be unusual and powerful. This creates sympathy while acknowledging the danger she represents. Rose's potential is enormous. She has abilities that Eveline, a designed bioweapon, possessed naturally. The post-game epilogue shows teenage Rose has developed significant powers, but maintains humanity and moral compass. She could be either the greatest threat the world faces or its greatest defender, depending on her choices. This sets up fascinating sequel possibilities. A game starring adult Rose, exploring her powers and responsibilities, would be unique in the franchise. She'd be a protagonist with bioweapon abilities fighting other bioweapons, creating interesting moral and tactical dynamics. The few scenes with teenage Rose suggest Capcom is considering this direction. The Duke references Re-Dead. One of the Duke's random dialogue lines references Resident Evil 4's merchant directly. "What are you buying? Haha, something an old friend of mine used to say." This confirms a connection between the two mysterious merchants who appear across different games separated by years and geography. The nature of this connection remains unexplained. Are they the same entity? Members of a merchant guild? Supernatural beings that exist across time? The game provides no answers, maintaining mystery around both characters. The reference simply confirms they know each other somehow, adding depth to their mysteriousness. This kind of continuity nod satisfies longtime fans while meaning nothing to players unfamiliar with earlier games. New players hear the Duke making a reference they don't understand, which reinforces his mysterious nature. Veteran players catch the callback and appreciate the connection. Both groups get something from the line, just different things. The merchant's relationship to the larger Resident Evil world is fascinating. They exist outside normal rules, appearing anywhere with impossible inventory, surviving situations that would kill normal humans. They're functionally supernatural, game mechanics given minimal narrative justification. Connecting them across games suggests they're more than simple gameplay abstractions, but the games wisely avoid over-explaining their nature. The entire RE engine was named after Resident Evil Capcom's RE engine, used for Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake, Resident Evil Village, and multiple other Capcom titles, is named after Resident Evil. The RE stands for both Resident Evil and Reach for the Moon, Capcom's development philosophy, but the primary association is the franchise that debuted the technology. The engine represented a complete rebuild of Capcom's development tools. Previous Resident Evil games used MT framework, which had served well but was becoming dated. The RE engine provided modern capabilities, photorealistic graphics, efficient development tools, robust VR support that Resident Evil 7 needed to achieve its vision. The engine's success led to widespread adoption within Capcom. Devil May Cry 5 uses RE engine. Monster Hunter Rise uses RE engine. Street Fighter 6 uses RE engine. Multiple Capcom franchises now share technology pioneered for Resident Evil, creating efficiency across the company's development pipeline. Naming the engine after one franchise while using it for many creates interesting associations. Every game using RE engine carries a tiny bit of Resident Evil's identity. Whether appropriate or not, the technology was built to create first-person horror, but proves flexible enough for action games, fighting games, and hunting games. This versatility demonstrates good engineering, but also creates funny situations where Street Fighter 6 technically runs on technology named after zombies. Remakes aren't canon. Capcom's Resident Evil remakes, particularly the recent RE2, RE3, and RE4 remakes, exist in ambiguous canonical space. They tell similar stories to the originals with significant differences in detail, dialogue, and events. This raises questions about which version is real in series continuity. Capcom has been deliberately vague about canon status. They avoid declaring remakes as replacing originals or existing in separate continuity. This lets fans choose which version they prefer as their personal canon, while avoiding definitive statements that would upset players attached to either version. The differences are substantial enough to matter. The RE2 remake significantly changes Mr. X's role, making him a constant pursuer rather than appearing in specific scenarios. The RE3 remake cuts entire sections of the original game while adding new content. Character personalities shift between versions. These aren't minor graphical updates, but fundamental reinterpretations. From practical perspective, treating remakes as non-canonical makes sense. It preserves the original games as legitimate rather than outdated drafts. It allows remakes creative freedom to change things rather than slavishly recreating every detail. It prevents the messy situation where later games would need to account for two different versions of events. The tyrant wore a coat in Remake. The original Resident Evil's tyrant appears naked except for pants, its mutated body fully visible. The 2002 remake gave the tyrant a long coat, covering much of its body and changing its silhouette significantly. This seemingly minor change actually impacts the creature's presence considerably. The coat makes the tyrant more mysterious. Instead of seeing all its mutations immediately, players see a humanoid figure that could almost pass for human at distance. The revealed mutations, the exposed heart, the clawed hand, become more shocking when contrasted with the relatively normal appearance of a coat. The design suggests the tyrant has been somewhat civilized, trained to wear clothing, which is more disturbing than simple nakedness. This change reflects the remake's general approach of adding atmosphere and detail. The coat required no gameplay justification, it's purely aesthetic, but it demonstrates how small visual choices affect tone. The original's naked tyrant emphasized its inhumanity, its status as a created weapon with no connection to humanity. The remake's coated tyrant suggests a weapon that retains disturbing vestiges of humanity despite its mutations. Subsequent appearances of tyrant-class enemies have varied in whether they wear clothing. Mr. X in RE2 wears his iconic fedora and coat. The Nemesis wears its trademark coat and restraining harness. These choices aren't random. They're deliberate decisions about how to present these creatures, balancing horror of mutation with disturbing humanity.